The dragon's new purpose. The gold was wrong. Smaug coiled himself deeper into the vast chamber beneath Erebor, his massive form disturbing avalanches of coins that cascaded like metallic waterfalls down the mountainous hoard. Each piece caught the light of his inner fire, sending fractured gleams dancing across the walls that had once housed the throne of Thror. The treasure stretched farther than most mortal eyes could follow. Goblets wrought in the ancient style of Dale, ceremonial armor that had never seen battle, strings of pearls from the far shores of Rhûn. It was magnificent. It was vast. It was insufficient. The dragon's great eye opened fully, the pupil contracting to a vertical slit as it swept across his domain. Somewhere in the darkness above, wind howled through passages that had once echoed with the songs of dwarven miners. Those songs were silenced now, had been silenced for the better part of a year since his fire had claimed this mountain. The silence should have pleased him. The treasure certainly should have pleased him. He was Smaug the mighty, Smaug the impenetrable, Smaug the unassailable, and all of Erebor's wealth was his. So why did it feel hollow? He shifted his weight, and a shower of silver cascaded from his flank. The sound should have been music to him, the sweet percussion of wealth beyond counting. Instead, it reminded him of rain. Common rain, falling on common stones in the common world beyond his mountain, the world where Dale's ashes still smouldered, where the men who had not fled were long since food for ravens, where his victory was already growing cold, a victory that had been too easy. The thought curled through his mind like smoke, acrid and unwelcome. The lake men had screamed prettily enough when his fire reached their wooden halls. The dwarven guards had died bravely, if futilely, their axes ringing against his scales like hail against iron. King Thror himself had faced Smaug in the throne room, standing defiant even as the heat of dragon fire turned the air itself to molten glass around them. But it had all been over so quickly. Smaug raised his great head, nostrils flaring. The sense of his conquest had faded. No more smoke from burning buildings, no more copper tang of spilled blood, no more sweet terror sweat from fleeing prey. Only the sterile smell of cold gold and ancient stone. Only the silence of a tomb. He was a dragon. He was death incarnate, fire and fury given form, the last of the great fire drakes of the north. His very presence should have been legend enough to echo through the ages of the world. Yet here he lay, surrounded by wealth that no king of men or dwarves could hope to match, and it felt like settling. The darkness beyond the hoard pressed closer, and with it came something else, a whisper so faint it might have been the settling of stone, so soft it could have been his own breath returning from the walls. But Smaug had been listening to whispers in the dark for longer than most races had existed, and he knew the difference between echo and intention. "Magnificent," the voice said, and it was not his own. Smaug's head snapped toward the sound, his neck extending like a striking serpent. Fire kindled in his throat, ready to burn away whatever fool had dared enter his domain. But there was nothing there, only shadow pooling in the spaces between pillars of treasure, only darkness that seemed somehow thicker than it should be. "Who dares?" The words rumbled from him like distant thunder, shaking coins from their careful piles. "Who enters the halls of Smaug the Mighty?" A fellow appreciator of ambition. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on currents of air that shouldn't exist in this sealed chamber. "Though I wonder if your ambition matches the grandeur of your reputation." Smaug's eyes blazed like furnaces. He knew this game, the dance of words before the killing, the delicate negotiation between powers who might actually pose a threat to one another. He had not encountered such a dance in decades. The novelty was almost refreshing. "My ambition," Smaug said, his voice dropping to a purr that could be heard through stone, "reduced the greatest dwarf kingdom in Middle-earth to ash and memory in a single day." What manner of creature questions the scope of Smaug's desires? One who knows of greater treasures than these. The shadow shifted, and for a moment Smaug caught a glimpse of something. Not a form exactly, but a presence that seemed to bend light around itself, a cold radiance that spoke of power older and deeper than dragonfire. Greater treasures? Smaug's laugh was like the grinding of millstones. "You mock me, shadow. There is no treasure in Middle-earth to match what lies beneath this mountain." "Is there not?" The voice carried a note of amusement that made the dragon's hackles rise. But beneath the amusement was something else. Knowledge. Certainty. The kind of confidence that came from truths too large for lesser minds to grasp. "Speak plainly," Smaug commanded. "Or burn." "The White City," the shadow said simply. "Minas Tirith, the guard of Gondor. Have you never wondered what lies in the vaults beneath that tower? What treasures the kings of Numenor brought with them across the sea?" Smaug's massive form went very still. He had heard tales of Gondor, of course. What dragon had not? The greatest kingdom of men, built on the bones of the empire that had humbled even Sauron the Great. But it was far to the south, beyond the reach of reasonable conquest, defended by armies that still remembered how to forge weapons that could bite dragon scale. "Gondor is mighty," Smaug admitted grudgingly, "but distant and defended." "Defended by men," the voice replied, and now there was no mistaking the contempt in it. "Men with swords and spears and shields, men who have grown soft in their white tower, who have forgotten the terror their ancestors knew when dragons ruled the skies. What are men to Smaug the Mighty?" The dragon's eyes narrowed. "You speak of their weakness, but not of their treasure. What lies in Gondor that could surpass the hoard of Erebor?" "The crown jewels of the Númenórean kings," the shadow whispered, and each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of possibility through Smaug's mind. Gems that caught the light of the trees before the sun was made. Silver wrought in Valinor itself, carried across the sea when the world was young. And beneath the city, beneath the city, lie the mithril reserves of the realm, veins of true silver that make the mines of Moria seem like a child's sandbox. Smaug's breathing quickened despite himself. Mithril, the metal more precious than gold, lighter than silk, harder than steel. The dwarves had killed and died for smaller amounts than what this voice described, and Númenórean silver, even dragons had sung of such things in the days when the world was younger and more full of wonders. "You lie," he said, but there was less conviction in it than before. "Do I?" The shadow seemed to smile, though it had no face. "Tell me, great Smaug, when you destroyed Dale, did you not wonder why their merchants spoke of trade routes that led south? Did you not question why the men of that city dressed their wives in jewelry that bore the stamp of Gondorian craftsmen? Where do you think that wealth originated?" The dragon was silent, his mind racing. He had indeed noticed such things in the brief moments between slaughter and triumph. Dale had been rich beyond what its size should have warranted, its people adorned with workmanship that spoke of distant workshops and foreign gold. He had assumed it came from trade with the woodland realm, or perhaps from dealings with the men of Lake Town. But if it came from Gondor— "The Palantir stones," the shadow continued, its voice now silk-smooth and honey-sweet. 7 seeing stones of Númenor, and Gondor still guards several of them. Imagine what such artifacts would add to your collection. The ability to see across all of Middle-earth from the comfort of your hoard, to watch the comings and goings of all who might threaten your domain. Smaug's claws dug gouges in the stone beneath him. Seeing stones, the very thought of such things made his treasure lust burn hotter than his fire. To possess not just wealth, but power, the power to know all secrets, to see all hidden things, even if such treasures exist, he said slowly. Gondor is no burned-out dwarf kingdom. Their armies are vast, their walls high. The assault would cost much effort. Would it? There was laughter in the darkness now, cold and sharp as winter wind. You are Smaug the Mighty, are you not? You are death incarnate, the nightmare that haunts the songs of men. What walls could stand against your fire? What armies could face you in open battle and survive? You conquered Erebor in a day. Would Gondor require longer than a week? The dragon's breath steamed in the cold air. The voice spoke truth, uncomfortable, intoxicating truth. He was mighty beyond the reckoning of mortal races. His fire could melt stone, his claws could shear steel, his very presence could break the courage of armies. Erebor had fallen so easily, not because he was weak, but because he was overwhelming. And when Gondor lies in ruins, the shadow whispered, when their treasures fill your hoard and their kings feed ravens, then all Middle-earth will know the true extent of Smaug's power. Then your victory will echo in song and story until the world itself grows old. The dragon who humbled the greatest kingdom of men. The worm who brought low the heirs of Númenor themselves. Glory. The word hung in the air like incense, sweet and heady. Smaug had tasted glory in the conquest of Erebor, but it had been brief, localized, already fading into mere memory. But to destroy Gondor, to burn the White City and claim the treasures of the Númenorian kings, that would be a deed worthy of legend. That would ensure his name lived forever in the songs of whatever races survived to remember. You offer much, Shadow, Smaug said finally, but you have not yet told me who you are or what you gain from Gondor's fall. I am one who appreciates ambition, the voice replied, and I gain the satisfaction of seeing power used properly. You are magnificent, great Smaug, but here you merely possess wealth. In Gondor, you could reshape the very course of history. You could become more than mighty. You could become inevitable. The dragon considered this, his vast mind turning over the possibilities like a merchant examining gems. The shadow spoke of greater treasures, of greater glory, of a conquest that would dwarf his victory at Erebor, and beneath it all, the promise of becoming something more than he was. Not just a dragon hoarding gold in a mountain, but a force that could alter the fate of nations. I will consider your words, Smaug said at last. Consider swiftly, the voice replied, and now it was fading, becoming one with the natural darkness of the chamber. Gondor's wealth grows with each passing day, but so does their complacency. Strike now, while they believe themselves safe in their white tower, and the kingdom will fall like ripe fruit. Wait too long, and they may remember how to fear dragons. The presence was gone, leaving only silence and the faint echo of possibility. Smaug remained motionless for a long time, his thoughts chasing each other like flames in a hearth. The gold beneath him felt colder now, less satisfying. The treasures of Erebor seemed suddenly small, provincial, inadequate for a being of his magnificence. Gondor. The name rolled through his mind like thunder, carrying with it visions of white towers aflame, of ancient vaults burst open, of treasures beyond imagining flowing into his hoard like a river of light. He thought of the seeing stones, of the power to watch and know all things. He thought of mithril veins that would make him the richest being in all the world. He thought of his name echoing through the ages as the dragon who brought down the kingdom of kings. Slowly, deliberately, Smaug began to rise. Coins cascaded from his massive form like water, creating new avalanches that reshaped the geography of his hoard. His great head turned toward the chamber's entrance, toward the passages that led to the outer world, toward the south, where a white city waited in ignorance of its doom. The treasures of Erebor would remain here, of course. A dragon's hoard was not abandoned lightly, but they would serve as foundation stones for something greater, the beginning of a collection that would be worthy of the last great dragon of the north. Smaug the Mighty spread his wings for the first time in a year, feeling the ancient power flow through membrane and bone. Soon, very soon, the skies would remember the shadow of dragons, and Gondor would learn what it meant to be visited by fire and death. The age of kings was ending. The age of Smaug had begun. The shadow over Rovanion. The trees felt it first. Galion had been walking the same patrol route through the borders of the woodland realm for 3 decades, and in all that time, the forest had spoken to him in whispers, the rustle of leaves carrying news of distant storms, the creak of branches warning of wolves or worse things moving in the dark. But this morning, the trees were screaming. Not with sound, of course. The Elven King's guard was not so fortunate as to hear the wood speech as clearly as his lord could. But there was something in the air itself, a tension that made his hands drift to his sword hilt without conscious thought. The very shadows seemed wrong, too deep and too cold for the pale light of dawn filtering through the canopy. He paused beside a great oak, whose trunk bore the silver marks of the realm's boundary, pressing his palm against the bark. The tree thrummed with distress, a deep, wordless anxiety that made his elven blood sing with unease. Whatever had disturbed the forest was large and moving fast and coming from the north. Galion looked up through the interwoven branches toward the distant peaks of the grey mountains, squinting against the morning light. For a moment, he saw nothing but the ordinary tapestry of leaf and sky. Then something moved across the sun. It was too far away to make out details, but the shape was unmistakable. Vast wings stretched wide, a serpentine neck extended in flight, a form that belonged to the darkest songs of the elder days. A shadow passed over the forest like the hand of death itself, and in its wake the trees bent away as though fleeing some invisible flame. Dragon. Galion ran. He pelted through the forest paths with the desperate speed that only terror could provide, his feet finding their way by instinct, while his mind reeled with implications. There had been no dragons in Middle-earth for centuries. The great drakes had died with their master in the ruin of Thangorodrim, leaving only stories and songs to mark their passing. Yet he had seen what he had seen, and the forest's distress confirmed what his eyes had told him. The halls of the Elven King lay deep within the wood, carved into the very roots of the earth where the greatest trees grew. Galion burst through the entrance without ceremony, his usual composure forgotten in the face of catastrophe. "My lord," he gasped, not caring that he interrupted the morning's audience with a delegation of traders from Dale. "My lord, there is—" "I know." King Thranduil stood at the great window that looked out over his domain, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of rigid control. But Galion could see the tension in those shoulders, the way his lord's jaw was set against some inner turmoil. The delegation from Dale had fallen silent, their faces pale with the kind of fear that came from recognition. "You have seen it too, my king?" Galion asked, though he already knew the answer. "The trees speak of shadow and fire," Thranduil replied quietly. "They speak of Smaug the mighty, whose flame consumed the mountain kingdom in a single day." He turned from the window, and Galion was startled to see something he had never witnessed in all his years of service: uncertainty in his lord's ancient eyes. "They speak of the dragon flying south, toward lands that haven't known such terror in an age of the world." One of the Dale merchants stepped forward, his merchant's composure cracking like ice in spring. "My lord, if the dragon has truly left Erebor, if he flies abroad once more, then Middle-earth faces a threat it is not prepared to meet," Thranduil finished. He moved to his throne, but did not sit. Instead, he gripped its carved arms like anchors in a storm. "Send word to all the border guards. Double the watches. If Smaug returns this way, we must have warning." "And if he does not return?" Galion asked, though he dreaded the answer. The Elven King's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then we pray to whatever powers still listen that his destination can stand against him. For if it cannot, the ruin will not stop there." The great bear lifted his massive head from the honey he had been enjoying, nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that had no business riding the wind this far south of the mountains. Sulphur and ash, the reek of burned things, the metallic tang of terror. And underneath it all, something else, the wild, predatory musk of a creature so ancient and so powerful that every instinct Beorn possessed screamed at him to seek shelter and pray he was not noticed. He rose to his full height, nearly twice the stature of a man even in this form, and shaded his eyes against the morning sun. There, a speck of darkness moving against the blue, too large and too purposeful to be any bird. As he watched, the shape grew larger, and with it came a sound like distant thunder, the rhythmic beating of wings vast enough to darken valleys. Beorn had lived through the devastation of Erebor. He had seen the smoke rising from the lonely mountain, had smelled the smoke of Dales burning on the wind for days afterward. He knew what flew overhead, and he knew with the certainty of long experience that its presence here meant nothing good for anyone within 100 leagues. The dragon passed without slowing, its flight carrying it south and west toward lands Beorn knew only from maps and stories. But as its shadow fell across his home, something else came with it, a whisper of knowledge that made his skin crawl beneath its coating of coarse hair. This was not merely a dragon hunting. This was Smaug with purpose, Smaug with destination. Someone or something had given the beast a target, and that target lay far from the mountain kingdom he had claimed for his own. Beorn dropped to all fours and began to run, not in his man shape, which was swift but not swift enough, but in the form that had given him his name. The great black bear that was his other self could cover ground like the wind itself, and there were those who needed to know what flew above them. The wise would want warning. Gandalf, if he could be found, would want warning most of all. The brown wizard felt the disturbance like a pain in his bones, a wrongness that made every bird for leagues around cry out in distress. Radagast stood in the center of the glade that served as his sanctuary, surrounded by creatures that had come to him, seeking explanation for the terror that had suddenly filled the sky. A red squirrel chattered frantically from his shoulder, its words too quick and frightened for any but Radagast to understand. A company of ravens wheeled overhead, their harsh voices forming a chorus of alarm that spoke of shadow and fire and the ancient fear that lived in the deepest parts of every creature's memory. Yes, yes, I know, Radagast murmured, stroking the squirrel's trembling form. I felt him pass as well. Such malice, such hunger. He looked up through the canopy at the empty sky, where the dragon's presence had been like a wound in the air itself. But where does he go? What draws Smaug from his hoard? A great grey wolf emerged from the undergrowth, its pack behind it, all of them pressing low to the ground in submission. They were not tame, no wolf truly was, but they recognized Radagast as one who spoke their language, one who understood the bonds that connected all living things. The grey wolf padded close enough to touch noses with the wizard, and in that contact, shared images that made Radagast's blood run cold. Refugees. Men and women and children fleeing south along the hidden paths of Rovanion, carrying tales of a dragon's roar that had shaken the very stones of their homes. They spoke of fire in the sky, of a shadow that had passed overhead like a herald of doom. They carried stories of the beast's path, and that path led ever southward toward the white tower that guarded the greatest kingdom of men. Gondor, Radagast breathed, and the word seemed to hang in the air like smoke. He flies toward Gondor. The wizard closed his eyes and reached out with senses that had been trained in the Undying Lands, feeling for the threads of power and purpose that connected all things. There, like a dark note in a symphony, like a discord that made the very music of creation falter. The necromancer's influence, subtle but unmistakable, wrapped around the dragon's purpose like chains of shadow. Sauron had always been the great deceiver, the master of lies and temptation. If Smaug flew toward Gondor, it was because something had convinced him that the treasures of that realm were worth claiming. And if the necromancer had convinced the mightiest dragon in Middle-earth to abandon his mountain fortress, Radagast opened his eyes and began to call, not with his voice, but with the power that flowed through him, the authority that came from long service to forces greater than any single wizard. He called to his swiftest messengers, the great eagles who owed no allegiance to any earthly power, the hawks whose eyes could see farther than any mortal vision, the ravens whose intelligence rivaled that of the wise themselves. Fly, he commanded them, and his words carried the weight of desperate urgency. Fly to Rivendell, to Lothlorien, to Isengard. Tell them what passes over Middle-earth. Tell them that Smaug the Mighty has left his hoard, and that shadow and flame fly toward the kingdom of the Dunedain. The eagle's cry reached Rivendell just as the sun touched the peaks of the misty mountains, and Elrond knew before he heard the message that it carried ill news. No creature of the air came to his realm with such urgency unless great events were in motion, and great events, in these days of growing shadow, were rarely cause for celebration. He stood on the covered bridge that connected the main hall to his private study, listening as Gwynhyr repeated the words that Radagast had entrusted to her care. With each syllable, the weight of coming catastrophe settled more heavily on his shoulders. "Smaug flies south," he said, when the eagle had finished, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of one who had lived through too many crises to waste energy on despair. "Toward Gondor. The brown wizard believes the necromancer has influenced the beast's purpose," Gwynhyr replied. "He says the dragon's path carries the taint of Dol Guldur's malice." Elrond nodded slowly. He had felt that malice growing stronger in recent years, a shadow that pressed ever outward from its stronghold in the south of Mirkwood. If Sauron, for he harbored no illusions about the true identity of the so-called necromancer, had found a way to turn Smaug to his purposes, then the dragon's departure from Erebor was not an opportunity, but a catastrophe in the making. "Summon the council," he commanded, "all who can be reached swiftly, and send word to Círdan at the Grey Havens, and to Galadriel in Lothlorien. If Gondor falls to Dragonfire, the balance of all Middle-earth shifts in Shadow's favor. As Gwynhyr launched herself from the bridge to carry word to the other realms, Elrond remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the southern sky. Somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers and forests of Ravania, a white city stood unaware that death flew toward it on wings of fire and malice. He thought of Isildur, who had stood in these very halls before, marching to war against the Dark Lord. He thought of Gil-galad, whose death had purchased the victory that had kept Middle-earth free for thousands of years. He thought of all the brave souls who had died to ensure that the light endured, and he wondered if their sacrifices were about to be undone by the greed of a single dragon. "Not if I can prevent it," he murmured to the wind, and began to plan. Gandalf felt the wrongness before he saw it, a disturbance in the fabric of the world that made his staff vibrate with sympathetic discord. He was traveling the old forest road when it struck him, that sudden sense of malevolent purpose cutting across the sky like a blade of shadow. The grey wizard pulled his horse to a stop and looked up, his keen eyes searching the heavens for the source of his unease. There, high above the forest canopy, nearly lost in the brightness of the noon sun, a shape that filled him with memories of the elder days, when dragons had been the terror of Beleriand and the bane of the Noldor. But this was no phantom of memory. This was Smaug, alive and abroad, his great wings carrying him southward with the purposeful speed of a creature that knew exactly where it was bound. Gandalf's grip tightened on his reins. Smaug had not left his mountain kingdom since claiming it, had shown no interest in conquest beyond the borders of Erebor and Dale. What could possibly have motivated him to abandon his horde and take to the skies once more? The answer came to him, with the cold certainty of a blade between the ribs. Dol Guldur lay not 40 leagues from where he sat, and the necromancer's power had been growing stronger with each passing year. If that dark spirit had found a way to corrupt or coerce the dragon's purpose. Shadowfax would be swifter, Gandalf muttered to himself, thinking of the great horse who served as the chief of the Mearas. But Shadowfax was in Rohan, days of hard riding to the south, and there was no time for such luxuries. Not when Dragonfire threatened to upset the balance that had kept Middle-earth at peace for so long. He urged his mount to greater speed, abandoning the well-travelled road for the narrow paths that led through the heart of Mirkwood. It was dangerous. The forest had grown dark and strange in recent years, full of creatures that served the Shadow's will. But it was also the fastest route to his destination. Behind him, the peasants and merchants who had been sharing the road watched in confusion as the wizard vanished into the trees. They had seen the shadow pass overhead, but they lacked the knowledge to understand what it meant. Gandalf envied them that ignorance, even as he raced toward what he feared would be the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in Middle-earth's long history. The road to Dol Guldur stretched ahead of him, and at its end waited answers he was not sure he wanted to hear. In the land south of the Gladden Fields, the first refugees were already beginning to flee. They were simple folk for the most part, farmers and shepherds, fishermen from the riverside villages, foresters who worked the edges of the great woods. They had no deep knowledge of dragons or the lore of ancient days, but they knew terror when they felt it, and the shadow that had passed overhead had carried terror in its wake like the scent of smoke. The dragon's roar echoed across the landscape as he passed, a sound like the breaking of mountains that sent flocks of birds wheeling in panic and caused horses to bolt in mindless flight. Children woke, screaming from naps they had been taking in perfect peace. Mothers clutched their babies closer and looked to their husbands for reassurance that could not be given. By evening, the roads were clogged with carts and wagons and families on foot, all of them moving north and east, away from the path the great shadow had taken. They carried what they could, and abandoned what they could not, driving their livestock ahead of them in great, confused herds that added their own voices to the chaos. "Where do we go?" asked a merchant whose wagon was loaded with goods he had been taking to market in the southern settlements. "Where is safe when dragons fly abroad?" No one could answer him. The oldest among them remembered the destruction of Dale only from stories, and those stories offered no guidance for how to survive what was coming. They could only flee, and hope that distance would be enough, and pray to whatever god still listened that the dragon's hunger would be satisfied before it turned toward their own homes. The sky remained clear as the refugees streamed northward, but they all kept looking over their shoulders, watching for the return of wings and fire. In their wake, they left empty villages and abandoned fields, creating a growing scar of desolation that marked Smaug's passage as surely as if he had already breathed flame upon the land. The age of peace was ending. The age of fire had begun. Gondor unprepared. The message arrived at Minas Tirith on the wings of exhaustion. Húrin, son of Beregond, had ridden his horse nearly to death, bringing word from the northern marches, changing mounts at every way station, and sleeping only when his body threatened to collapse beneath him. Even so, it had taken him the better part of a week to reach the White City, and by the time he stumbled into the throne room of the citadel, his report sounded like the ravings of a man driven mad by sun and wind. "Dragons!" he gasped, falling to one knee before the throne of King Ondóhr. "My lord, there are reports. The northern settlements speak of dragons in the sky." The assembled court exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to openly amused. Lord Húrin was known as a steady man, not given to flights of fancy, but the exhaustion of his ride was written clearly in his bloodshot eyes and the tremor in his voice. King Ondóhr leaned forward in his throne, his weathered face creased with concern that was not entirely for his messenger's apparent state. "Speak plainly, Captain. What exactly did you see?" "Not I, my lord," Húrin replied, struggling to catch his breath. "The refugees, hundreds of them, streaming south from Rovaniol. They speak of a great shadow that passed overhead, of roaring that shook the very stones from their foundations. They say—" He paused, clearly aware of how his words would sound. "They say it was Smaug the Terrible, flying south toward our lands." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Lord Forlong of Lossanach let out a bark of laughter that echoed through the hall like a physical blow. "Smaug the Terrible?" he said, his voice rich with derision. "The dragon of Erebor. Captain Húrin, with respect, that beast has not stirred from his mountain in near a year. Why would he abandon the greatest treasure hoard in Middle-earth to go wandering about the countryside?" "The refugees seemed certain, my lord," Húrin insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "They spoke of fire in the sky, of a shadow that—" "Refugees speak of many things when they are frightened," interrupted Lord Alcarin of Dol Amroth. "They see wolves in every shadow and orcs in every bush, a flock of great birds flying overhead, perhaps, or clouds casting unusual shadows. These things grow in the telling until they become monsters." King Ondóhr raised a hand for silence, his grey eyes fixed on the messenger, with an intensity that made the surrounding nobles fall quiet. Unlike his counselors, the king had lived through enough genuine crises to recognize the difference between panic and legitimate warning. "Tell me of these refugees," he commanded. "From where do they come? What do they carry with them?" Húrin straightened slightly, relieved to be addressing details rather than defending the incredible. "From all across southern Rovanion, my lord. Farmers mostly, but also merchants and craftsmen." They bring livestock and what goods they could carry, but they have abandoned their homes. The roads are clogged with them. And they all tell the same tale? Variations of it, my lord. Some speak of roaring, others of shadow. But all agree that something large passed overhead, flying south with great speed, and— He hesitated again, then pressed on. The animals are still fleeing, my lord. The birds fly in great flocks toward the east, and the beasts of the field have abandoned the northern territories entirely. That gave the assembled nobles pause. Animals, as every countryman knew, had senses far keener than those of men. They could feel earthquakes coming days before they struck, could sense storms while the sky was still clear. If the creatures of the wild were fleeing in such numbers. Steward Pelendur, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now stepped forward. He was an older man, grey-bearded and sharp-eyed, who had served the crown for more than 30 years. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of long experience and careful thought. "My lord," he said, addressing the king directly, "whether the threat is real or imagined, the fact remains that we have hundreds of refugees on our borders, and their fear is spreading to our own people. Perhaps it would be wise to take certain precautionary measures." Lord Forlong rolled his eyes. "Precautionary measures against what? A dragon that may or may not exist, flying toward a destination we cannot confirm, for reasons we cannot fathom? Steward Pelendur, with respect, we cannot fortify the kingdom against every shadow and rumor." "Can we not?" Pelendur's voice was mild, but there was steel beneath it. "Tell me, Lord Forlong, what would be the cost of preparing our defenses against a dragon attack? A few days of extra drilling for the guards, perhaps. Some attention paid to our stores of arrows and siege engines. The movement of non-essential civilians away from potential targets." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "And what would be the cost of ignoring such warnings, should they prove true?" The hall fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. Even the most skeptical of the nobles could feel the weight of that unspoken answer. King Ondahur studied his steward for a long moment, then turned his gaze to Captain General Morwen, who had been standing quietly near the great windows that looked out over the Pelennor fields. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered and competent, who had earned her rank through merit rather than birth. Her dark eyes showed none of the amusement that had marked her colleagues' responses. "Captain General," the king said, "what is your assessment?" Morwen stepped forward, her bearing crisp and professional. "My lord, I would echo the steward's concerns. Whether or not a dragon truly threatens us, the reports suggest some manner of large-scale disturbance in the north. It would be prudent to increase our readiness." "You believe these tales of dragons?" Lord Alcarin asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I believe in being prepared," Morwen replied evenly. "Gondor's strength has always lain in our ability to respond swiftly to threats. If we wait until we are certain of danger, we may find ourselves responding to catastrophe instead of preventing it." Lord Forlong shook his head in exasperation. "This is madness. We would have the entire kingdom in uproar over the fears of a few northern peasants. The people will panic. Trade will suffer. Our enemies will see us, jumping at shadows, and question our resolve." "Our enemies," Steward Pelendur observed quietly, "are welcome to question whatever they choose. Dead men ask no questions at all." The exchange was interrupted by the sound of commotion from the outer courts, raised voices, the clatter of hooves on stone, the kind of disturbance that usually meant urgent news. A few moments later, the great doors of the throne room opened to admit another messenger, this one bearing the blue and silver colors of the rangers who guarded Gondor's northern borders. The ranger, a lean, weathered man whose gear showed signs of hard traveling, approached the throne with the controlled haste of one who carried news too important for ceremony. "My Lord King," he said, offering a quick bow, "I bring word from Ithilien. Our scouts report unusual activity along the borders of Mordor. The enemy's servants stir, and there are signs that suggest coordination with some external force." King Onderher's expression hardened. "Speak plainly, Ranger. What manner of coordination?" "Orc bands moving in unusual patterns, my lord. Not raiding or pillaging, but positioning themselves as though they await some signal. And there have been sightings of fell creatures in the sky above Mordor, winged shapes that our watchers describe as scouts or messengers." The king exchanged a meaningful glance with his steward. If Sauron's servants were stirring in coordination with some external threat. "How long ago were these sightings?" Pelendur asked. 3 days past, my lord. I rode hard to bring word, but the movements may have continued." 3 days. If the northern refugees' reports were accurate, that would place the dragon sightings and the unusual activity in Mordor at roughly the same time. The coincidence was troubling, to say the least. "Lord Alcarin," the king said suddenly, "you expressed concern about our enemies questioning our resolve. Tell me, what would you have them think if Gondor fell to a threat we could have prepared for, but chose to ignore?" The Lord of Dol Amroth had no ready answer for that. King Onderher rose from his throne, his decision crystallizing into action. "Captain General Morwen, you will begin immediate preparations for the defense of Osgiliath and Minas Tirith. Recall the garrison commanders for briefing. Have our weapons masters examine the archives for any records of fighting dragons, if such records exist." "At once, my lord," Morwen replied, relief evident in her voice. "Steward Pelendur, coordinate with the Captain General on evacuation procedures for the civilian population. Nothing too obvious. We do not wish to cause panic, but make ready for the possibility that non-combatants may need to be moved to places of safety." "It shall be done, my lord." "And summon Master Hurin to the archives," the king continued, referring to the chief among the lore masters who maintained Gondor's vast collection of records and histories. "If dragons indeed threaten us, we must know everything our ancestors learned about fighting such creatures." As the assembled nobles began to disperse to carry out their orders, the king remained standing by his throne, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the windows. Lord Forlong approached him hesitantly. "My lord," he said, I pray that we are wrong about this threat." King Onderher turned to look at him, and for a moment his kingly composure slipped enough to reveal the weight of responsibility that lay beneath it. "So do I, Forlong," he said quietly. "So do I. But if we are not wrong, if these reports prove true, then Gondor faces a trial unlike any in living memory, and I would rather be a king who prepared for a threat that did not come than one who failed to prepare for a threat that did." In the archives beneath the citadel, Master Hurin was already at work when the king's summons reached him. The elderly lore master had heard the commotion in the courts above, and experience had taught him to anticipate what manner of research might be required. When his assistants brought word of the king's commands, he was already pulling ancient volumes from their shelves. "Dragons," he muttered to himself as he opened a tome that had not been consulted in centuries. As if we didn't have troubles enough with orcs and corsairs. The records were fragmentary at best. The dragons of the elder days had been creatures of legend even to the men of Númenor, and most of what Gondor knew came from the tales of the Eldar rather than direct experience. But there were accounts, chronicles from the wars against Morgoth, treatises on the nature of dragon fire, tactical analyses of the great worm's strengths and weaknesses. As Master Hurin read, his expression grew increasingly grim. Dragons, the texts made clear, were not merely large and dangerous beasts. They were beings of immense cunning and malice, creatures whose very presence could break the courage of armies. Their fire could melt stone and steel alike. Their armored hides could turn aside the finest weapons, and their vast strength could topple the walls of fortresses. How does one fight such a creature? He wondered aloud, turning pages that crackled with age. The answers, when they came, were not encouraging. Speed and courage, the texts suggested. Coordinated attacks with weapons of the finest make, devices for casting projectiles at great range, and above all, the willingness to accept terrible losses in exchange for even the smallest chance of victory. Master Hurin closed the book and rubbed his tired eyes. If dragons indeed flew toward Gondor, then the kingdom faced a trial that would test every fibre of its strength. The question was not whether they could survive such an assault. The question was, how many would die before it was over? The great gates of Minas Tirith were just closing for the evening, when another lone rider approached along the Pelennor road. Unlike the previous messengers, this one showed no signs of exhaustion or hard travel. He rode a grey horse that seemed to glide across the ground rather than gallop, and his grey robes and pointed hat marked him as one of the Astari, the wizards who wandered Middle-earth on errands that few could fathom. Gandalf the Grey had ridden hard from the borders of Mirkwood, but not so hard as to exhaust himself or his mount. There would be time for rest later, if rest was still possible in a world where dragons flew at the bidding of Shadow. The guards at the gate recognized him and offered escort to the citadel, but Gandalf declined with a courteous nod. He knew the way to the halls of the King of Gondor, and he suspected that his arrival had already been noted by those who watched for such things. As he rode through the winding streets of the city, he found his worst fears confirmed. The people went about their evening business with the forced normalcy of those who sensed trouble, but did not yet understand its nature. Children played in the courtyards while their mothers watched the skies with troubled eyes. Merchants closed their shops while casting glances toward the northern roads, where rumors of strange tidings had begun to filter through the city like smoke. They knew something was wrong. They simply did not yet know how wrong it was. When Gandalf reached the citadel, he found it in a state of controlled activity that spoke well of Gondor's leadership. Guards moved with purpose through the corridors, and he could hear the distant sounds of weapons being readied and defenses being checked. Someone, at least, had taken the warning seriously. He was ushered quickly into the throne room, where King Ondoher waited with his closest advisers. The king's face showed the strain of the day's revelations, but his bearing remained composed and alert. "Gandalf the Grey," Ondoher said, rising from his throne in a gesture of respect that surprised many of his nobles. "Your arrival is both welcome and worrying. Tell me you bring word that our fears are groundless." Gandalf's expression was grim as he removed his hat and bowed in return. "I wish I could offer such comfort, my Lord King, but I come to warn you of danger greater than your darkest fears. Smaug the Mighty has indeed left Erebor, and his path leads directly toward your realm." The words fell into the throne room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the assembled nobles. Even those who had argued most strongly against the dragon reports felt their certainty crumble in the face of the wizard's authority. "You have seen this yourself?" Steward Pelennor asked. "I have," Gandalf replied simply, "and I have felt the shadow that drives him. This is no mere dragon greed, no random act of destruction. Smaug flies with purpose, and that purpose serves the designs of the enemy." King Onderher sank back into his throne as the full implications of those words settled upon him. A dragon was terrible enough. A dragon guided by the malice of Sauron was a catastrophe beyond reckoning. "How long do we have?" he asked. Gandalf closed his eyes for a moment, calculating distances and speeds with the precision of long experience. Perhaps a week, if he pauses to hunt or rest. Perhaps less, if his purpose drives him without pause. "Then we must make ready," the king said, his voice steady despite the fear that showed in his eyes. "Captain General Morwen, how stand our defences?" "We have perhaps 8,000 men in the city and its immediate surroundings," she replied. "Another 10,000 could be recalled from the outlying garrisons within 3 days, if we send word immediately." "Send it," the king commanded. "And send word to our allies as well. Dol Amroth, the Riddermark, even to the Shire if needs be. If Gondor falls to dragon fire, all of Middle-earth will feel the consequences." As orders flew and preparations began, Gandalf remained silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. The machinery of defense was in motion now, but he feared it might not be enough. Smaug was mighty beyond the reckoning of mortal kings, and if Sauron's influence truly guided the dragon's purpose, the next week would determine the fate of the greatest kingdom of men, and Gandalf was not at all certain they would survive to see its end. The dragon descends. The moment Smaug crested the misty mountains and looked down upon the green lands of Gondor stretching before him, he understood why the shadow voice had spoken so persuasively of this realm's wealth. Below him lay a kingdom of impossible grandeur, its fields rich and golden in the morning sun, its rivers gleaming like silver ribbons, and in the distance, glorious beyond his wildest imaginings, the White City itself. Minas Tirith rose from the eastern mountains like a work of the gods, its 7 levels carved into the living rock, its walls and towers catching the light and throwing it back in a cascade of brilliance that made even dragon eyes water. The Tower of Ecthelion pierced the sky at its summit, white as pearl, proud as the kings who had built it. Around the city, the Pelennor fields spread like a green carpet, dotted with villages and farms that spoke of prosperity beyond measure. Smaug hung motionless in the air, his great wings riding the mountain thermals as he drank in the sight of his prize. This was no crude dwarf kingdom carved from raw stone, no simple trading town built of wood and clay. This was the greatest achievement of the race of men, the heir to Númenor's glory, rich with the accumulated wealth of 3,000 years. And it would be his. The dragon's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like yellowed swords. The White City would be the crown jewel of his conquest, but wisdom suggested beginning elsewhere. Let the defenders of that mighty fortress watch helplessly as their outlying territories burned. Let them taste despair before he brought them fire. His great head turned toward the northern provinces, where smoke already rose from a dozen hearth-fires in the morning air. Soon that smoke would have a different source entirely. Smaug folded his wings and dropped toward the earth like a falling star. The village of Talath Dirnan had been stirring to life when the shadow fell across it. Tormund the blacksmith was already at work in his forge, the ring of his hammer joining the morning chorus of roosters and cattle. Children ran through the streets with the boundless energy that came of living in a place where the greatest dangers were wolves and the occasional band of brigands. Mothers hung washing on lines that stretched between houses like festival bunting. It was Marta, the baker's wife, who first noticed that the birds had stopped singing. She paused in her work of setting bread to rise, flour-dusted hands still buried in the dough, and tilted her head to listen. The silence pressed against her ears like a physical weight. No larks, no finches, no sparrows chattering from the eaves. Even the ever-present sound of wind through the grain fields seemed muted, as though the very air held its breath. Then came the shadow. It swept across the village like the hand of death itself, blotting out the sun and plunging the morning into a false twilight that made candle flames flicker and dogs howl in terror. Marta looked up through her window and saw something that her mind refused to accept. Wings vast enough to shade half the village, a serpentine neck longer than the great hall where the village gathered for festivals, eyes like furnaces burning in the darkness above. Dragon. The word formed in her mind, just as Smaug opened his jaws and breathed fire. The baker's shop vanished in the first gout of flame, its timber walls and thatched roof becoming ash and smoke in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Marta died without pain, her scream lost in the roar of dragon fire that swept across Talath Dernan like a tide of liquid light. Tormund the blacksmith had just enough time to understand what was happening before the flames reached his forge. He tried to run, dropping his hammer and racing for the door. But dragonfire moved faster than any man could hope to. The heat struck him like a physical blow, searing the air from his lungs and setting his hair ablaze. He made it 3 steps before the fire claimed him. The children in the streets simply vanished. One moment they were playing their ancient games of tag and hide and seek, their laughter bright as silver bells. The next moment there was only flame and smoke and the acrid smell of burning that would linger over the village site for years to come. Smaug circled above the destruction with the satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his work. The village burned with the clean, bright flame that came of well-seasoned timber and oil-soaked thatch. No structure remained intact, no life stirred among the ruins. In less than 5 minutes, he had erased 3 centuries of human habitation as thoroughly as if it had never existed. It was a good beginning. The smoke was visible from the walls of Minas Tirith. Captain Boromir of the Tower Guard, father to young sons who bore his name and that of his brother, stood on the battlements of the 4th level and watched the black pillar rising from the northern horizon with the sick certainty of a man witnessing prophecy fulfilled. "How many villages lie in that direction?" asked Lieutenant de Ruffin, his voice carefully steady despite the tremor in his hands as he gripped his spear. "Talath Dernan is the closest," Boromir replied. "Perhaps 2 leagues beyond that, the farming settlement of Linhir, and Caer Andros guards the river, crossing another 5 leagues north." They both knew what the smoke meant. The dragon had arrived, and Gondor's outlying territories were paying the price of their kingdom's wealth. The reports had been true, the preparations justified, and none of that knowledge provided the slightest comfort as they watched their people die. "Should we send relief forces?" de Ruffin asked, though they both knew the answer. "To fight what?" Boromir's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "We have 18,000 men in the kingdom, Lieutenant. The dragon has already proven he can destroy an entire village in minutes. Would you have me march our soldiers into that fire and add their deaths to the count?" A horn sounded from the citadel above, the long, mournful note that summoned the city's defenders to immediate council. As they descended the winding stairs toward the throne room, both men found themselves wondering if they would live to see another sunset. Caer Andros had stood for more than 1,000 years, its walls and towers carved from the living rock of the island that split the Anduin's current. The fortress commanded the river crossing with the authority of an iron fist, its ballistas and catapults positioned to rain destruction on any force that dared approach the northern approaches to Gondor. Captain Mablung had commanded the garrison for 7 years, and in that time he had never faced an enemy his engines could not handle. Orcs died when struck by ballista bolts. Southron ships burned when struck by fire arrows. Even the great Mumakil of Harad could be brought down by concentrated volleys from his war machines. But he had never faced a dragon. Smaug appeared over the fortress like a storm cloud given malevolent life, his great wings casting shadows that turned noon to midnight. The dragon had grown bolder since his first attack, more willing to display his terrible majesty for all to see. He circled Caer Andros with the lazy confidence of a hawk studying a mouse. "Ready the engines!" Mablung shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the fortress courtyard. "All crews to your stations!" The men moved with the precision of long training, swiveling the great ballistas toward the circling dragon and cranking the windlasses that would give their bolts the force to pierce armor. The largest of the engines, a siege ballista that normally required 6 men to operate, was loaded with a bolt of iron-hard oak tipped with steel that could punch through a castle gate. "Range," called the chief engineer. 200 yards and closing," replied the spotter, his voice steady despite the sweat that beaded his forehead. "Target bearing. Mark. Loose." 6 ballista bolts flew toward Smaug in a volley that should have brought down any flying creature ever born. The dragon saw them coming. His great head turned to track their flight with the casual interest of a scholar observing an experiment. Then, with a movement so slight it seemed almost absent-minded, he shifted his position in the air. The bolts passed harmlessly beneath his belly. Smaug's laughter rumbled across the river like distant thunder. With a contemptuous flick of his wings, he dove toward the fortress, his speed increasing until he moved like a hurled spear. The defenders had just enough time to load a second volley before he was among them. The dragon struck the largest ballista with one taloned foot, crushing the engine and its crew into splinters and bone. His tail lashed out to shatter a catapult, while his great head turned toward the men who still stood frozen at their posts. And then came the fire. Captain Mablung had thought he understood destruction. He had seen cities taken by siege, had watched buildings burn and walls fall, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of dragon flame. The impossible heat that turned stone to slag and steel to vapor. The light so brilliant it seared the eyes of anyone who looked directly into it. The fortress's main tower, built to withstand the battering rams and catapults of mortal armies, lasted perhaps 10 seconds under Smaug's assault. Ancient stones that had been cut and fitted by master masons cracked and crumbled under the heat. Iron gates melted like candle wax. Men screamed as their armor became ovens that cooked them within their own protection. Mablung himself survived only because he had the presence of mind to throw himself behind the fortress's great cistern when the dragon turned his attention toward the command post. The stone basin, filled with thousands of gallons of water, provided just enough protection to save his life, though the heat was so intense that the water began to steam and bubble like soup in a cauldron. When the flames finally stopped, Caer Andros was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin of melted stone and twisted metal, its proud walls reduced to rubble, its garrison scattered like leaves before a hurricane. Of the 120 men who had manned the position that morning, fewer than 20 survived, and most of those bore burns that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Smaug perched on what had once been the fortress's highest tower, his great weight causing the damaged structure to sag and crack beneath him. He surveyed his work with the satisfaction of a dragon who had proven a point that needed proving. "Let this be your lesson," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the river to where the survivors crouched among the ruins. "I am Smaug the Mighty, Smaug the Impenetrable, Smaug the Unassailable. Your walls are kindling before my fire. Your weapons are toys that cannot scratch my scales. Your armies are insects to be crushed beneath my claws." He spread his wings wide, blotting out the sun. "Tell your white city what you have seen here. Tell them that death comes on wings of fire, and that all the treasures of Gondor will soon be mine." With that, the dragon launched himself into the air, leaving behind only ruins and smoke, and the bitter knowledge that Gondor's greatest fortress had fallen in less time than it took to eat a meal. The survivors reached Minas Tirith 3 hours before sunset, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces marked by smoke and terror. Captain Mablung rode at their head, his left arm hanging useless at his side, and his uniform blackened by soot, but his bearing still proud despite the magnitude of his defeat. King Ondoher received them in the great courtyard, rather than the throne room. There was no time for ceremony when catastrophe rode on dragon's wings. The king's face was grave as he listened to Mablung's report, but beneath the gravity lay something harder and more dangerous. "How many?" was all he said when the captain finished speaking. "Of my command, perhaps 18 men survive whole. Another dozen may live if they receive swift care. The rest—" Mablung's voice broke slightly. "The rest are gone, my lord. The fortress is lost." "And the dragon?" "Flew south toward Osgiliath when he finished with us. My lord, I have served in this army for 15 years, fought orcs and Southrons and every manner of enemy that threatens our borders. But this—" He shook his head helplessly. "This is beyond anything we can stand against. The beast's fire melts stone, my lord. Our weapons cannot reach him when he flies, and when he closes to attack, nothing can survive." King Ondoher was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtyard walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had just watched his kingdom's illusions die. 18,000 men, he said quietly. "The greatest army Gondor has fielded in living memory. And you tell me it would not be enough." "Against this dragon, my lord?" Mablung met his king's eyes steadily. "I fear even twice that number would only provide more fuel for his fire." The king nodded slowly, as though Mablung had confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Around them, the sounds of preparation continued. Men shouting orders, weapons being sharpened, supplies being moved. But there was a frantic quality to the activity now, the desperate motion of people who knew they prepared for their own destruction. "Nevertheless," King Ondoher said finally, "we prepare. We fight. We make the dragon pay for every league, every building, every life. Gondor has stood for 3,000 years, Captain. It will not fall without leaving such scars on its destroyer that all Middle-earth will remember what it cost to bring down the realm of the Dunedain." Mablung straightened and offered his king a salute that somehow maintained its dignity despite his bandaged arm. "Then we stand, my lord, and if we must die, we die as men of Gondor." "As men of Gondor," the king agreed, and his words echoed through the courtyard like a prayer. Above them, the sky remained clear and blue, but everyone present found themselves looking toward the northern horizon, where smoke still rose in black pillars that marked the dragon's path. Somewhere beyond those smoke columns, Smaug the Mighty prepared for his assault on Osgiliath. The true test was yet to come. The siege of Osgiliath. Dawn came to Osgiliath with the promise of death. Captain General Morwen stood on the eastern parapet of the Great Bridge, watching the northern horizon, where smoke still rose from yesterday's destruction. The ancient city spread around her like a jewel set in silver, its towers and halls rising from both banks of the Anduin, connected by the magnificent bridge that had stood for 2,000 years as a symbol of Gondor's enduring strength. She had arrived in the night, with what forces could be spared from Minas Tirith. 3,000 of Gondor's finest soldiers, along with every siege engine and war machine that could be transported along the river road. It was not enough. She knew it. Her men knew it. And somewhere in the smoking ruins to the north, the dragon undoubtedly knew it as well. But knowing the futility of their position did not absolve them of the duty to defend it. "Captain General," called Lieutenant Targan from his position at one of the great catapults. "The men are asking, what are our orders if the beast comes for the bridge itself?" Morwen did not answer immediately. Below them, the Anduin flowed swift and deep, its waters catching the early light like molten silver. The great bridge was more than a crossing. It was the heart of Osgiliath, the spine that held the city together. If the bridge fell, the city would be split in two, its defenses scattered and useless. "We hold," she said finally. "Whatever comes, we hold until the civilians are across the river or dead. After that—" She shrugged with a casualness that fooled no one. "After that, we make the dragon remember Osgiliath." A horn blast echoed from the watchtowers, 3 long notes that meant enemy sighted. Morwen lifted her spyglass and scanned the northern sky, her stomach knotting as she found what she was looking for. There, a speck of darkness against the pale morning clouds, growing larger with each heartbeat, wings that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon, the slow, deliberate beat of flight that spoke of a creature in no hurry, confident in its overwhelming power. "Sound the general alarm," Morwen commanded. "All civilians to the western bank immediately. All combat troops to positions." She lowered the spyglass and looked around at her officers, seeing her own grim determination reflected in their faces. "Gentlemen, today we discover what men of Gondor are truly made of." Smaug approached Osgiliath with the careful attention of a connoisseur examining a fine wine. The city was old, older than most mortal realms, and age meant accumulated wealth. More importantly, it meant accumulated artifacts of power. The dragon's supernatural senses could taste magic in the air above the city, ancient enchantments woven into stone and steel by craftsmen who had learned their arts in the undying lands themselves. Somewhere in that sprawling collection of towers and halls lay a treasure that called to him with a voice sweeter than gold. One of the seeing stones of Númenor. The Palantir of Osgiliath, greatest of the 7 stones, save for the master stone of Tol Eressëa itself. With such an artifact in his hoard, he would possess not just wealth, but the ability to see across all of Middle-earth, to watch his enemies and anticipate their movements, to know secrets that no dragon had ever known. But first, he would have to dig it out from under several thousand armed and desperate humans. The dragon's lips pulled back in anticipation. He had enjoyed the morning's destruction at the border fortresses, but this would be different. This would be a true test of his might against the greatest military power in Middle-earth. Let them bring their engines of war and their finest soldiers. Let them make their last stand in the shadow of their most ancient city. When the sun set, Smaug would possess treasures beyond counting, and Gondor would possess nothing but ashes and memory. He began his descent toward the great bridge, fire already kindling in his throat. The first assault came at the bridge itself, just as Morwen had predicted. Smaug struck the center span like a thunderbolt, his massive talons gouging deep furrows in stonework that had weathered 2 millennia of war and weather. The ancient masonry, built to bear the weight of armies and siege engines, cracked and groaned under the dragon's assault, but it held, a testament to the skill of the Númenorian craftsmen who had raised it in the days when the world was younger. "Now!" Morwen shouted, and the air filled with the singing of bowstrings and the thrum of ballistae. 100 arrows and 20 ballista bolts converged on the dragon from positions carefully prepared along both banks of the river. It was a volley that should have brought down a company of cavalry, concentrated with mathematical precision on the beast that clung to their bridge like some nightmare made manifest. The missiles struck Smaug's armoured hide and bounced away like raindrops striking granite. A few found gaps between his scales and drew thin lines of dark blood, but the wounds were no more significant than pinpricks to a creature of his vast size and vitality. The dragon turned his great head toward the eastern batteries and laughed, a sound like grinding millstones that made the bridge stones vibrate beneath his weight. "Is this the might of Gondor?" he roared, his voice echoing across the water like thunder. "Toys and pinpricks? I have faced the warriors of Dale and found them wanting. I have broken the fortress of Caer Andros like kindling. What can the men of this ancient city offer that those could not?" His answer came not in words, but in the sudden appearance of something the garrison had been saving for just this moment. A great ballista mounted on the bridge's highest tower, its bolt tipped with black iron from the mines of Erebor, and engraved with runes of piercing that had been crafted by dwarf-smiths in the days before the dragon's coming. The bolt took Smaug in the shoulder, punching through his armoured scales to bury itself deep in the muscle beneath. For the first time since leaving his mountain, the dragon felt pain. Real pain, sharp and shocking and infuriating. Dark blood flowed down his flank to spatter on the bridge stones below. Smaug's roar of rage shook dust from every building in Osgiliath. His great neck swung toward the tower that housed the accursed engine, and his eyes blazed with fury that had been building for 1,000 years of unchallenged dominance. "You dare!" he snarled and opened his jaws wide. The dragon fire that poured forth was not the measured flame he had used on the outlying villages, not the controlled burn that had reduced Caer Andros to manageable ruin. This was the full fury of Smaug the Mighty, unleashed without restraint, a torrent of heat and light that turned the tower and its brave defenders to vapor in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Where the ballista had stood, only slag and smoke remained. Lieutenant Targon watched the tower die and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had served in the armies of Gondor for 12 years, had fought orcs and Southrons and pirates from Umbar. He had always believed that courage and skill could overcome any enemy, that men fighting for their homes and families could stand against any darkness. The dragon's fire made a mockery of such beliefs. "Fall back to the second positions," he shouted to the men under his command, though he wondered if there was any point. How could they fight an enemy that could erase their strongest defenses with a single breath? How could they stand against a creature that laughed at their finest weapons and shrugged off wounds that would fell a troll? Behind him, he could hear Captain General Morwen calling orders, her voice steady despite the catastrophe that unfolded around them. The woman had nerves of steel. He had to give her that. Even as their most powerful weapons proved useless, even as their defensive positions were reduced to molten slag, she continued to fight as though victory remained possible. Perhaps that was what courage truly meant. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to fight without hope. Targon gripped his sword tighter and prepared to discover whether he possessed such courage himself. Smaug descended to the bridge level, his great bulk settling onto the ancient stonework with a weight that made the entire structure groan and sway. From this close, the defenders could see every detail of his terrible magnificence. Scales that caught the morning light like dark mirrors, claws longer than sword blades that scored deep gouges in the stone, eyes like furnaces that seemed to burn with their own inner fire. Where is it?" the dragon demanded, his voice now low and conversational, somehow more terrifying than his roars had been. "Where is the seeing stone of Osgiliath?" Captain General Morwen stepped forward, her sword drawn, though she knew it would avail her nothing. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered and confident, but she looked like a child before the dragon's immensity. "What seeing stone?" she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "I know of no such artifact." Smaug's laugh was soft as silk and cold as winter. "Do not play games with me, mortal. I can smell the stone's power from here. Ancient magic, wrought in the undying lands, steeped in the wisdom of the Eldar. It calls to me like a beacon in the night." His great head swung closer, until his breath stirred the plume on Morwen's helm. "Tell me where it lies, and perhaps I will allow some of your people to live." "Go to the void," Morwen replied calmly. The dragon's head pulled back slightly, and for a moment something that might have been respect flickered in his burning eyes. "Brave words, for one who stands helpless before my might." "Very well. I shall find it myself, and when I do, I will make certain that every man, woman and child in this city pays for your defiance." With that, Smaug launched himself into the air once more, but this time his flight carried him not away from the city, but deeper into it. His massive form settled onto the roof of the great hall that served as Osgiliath's center of governance, crushing the ancient timber and tile beneath his weight. And then he began to dig. The destruction that followed was methodical and terrible. Smaug tore through Osgiliath's buildings like a scholar searching through scrolls, his claws and fire reducing each structure to rubble as he sought the hidden chamber where the Palantir lay concealed. Ancient libraries burned like torches. Towers that had stood since the foundation of the city toppled like felled trees. Homes that had sheltered families for generations became ash and smoke in moments. The defenders fought on, driven by desperation and duty rather than any hope of victory. They harassed the dragon with constant arrow fire, struck at him with spears and swords when he descended close enough, and died with the names of Gondor and their loved ones on their lips. Their attacks were no more effective than those of insects against an elephant, but they fought because it was what men of Gondor did when the darkness came calling. Captain General Morwen led charge after futile charge, her sword bright in her hand as she struck at the dragon's flanks and feet. Twice she drew blood, her blade finding gaps in his armored hide with the precision born of a lifetime's training. Twice Smaug's tail lashed out in response, missing her by inches and leaving craters in the stone where she had stood moments before. "Why do you persist?" the dragon asked during a brief lull in his excavations, his great head turning toward the woman who had become the symbol of Osgiliath's defiance. "You cannot harm me. You cannot save your city. You can only die and take your men with you." "Because it is our duty," Morwen replied simply. "Because this is our home. Because some things are worth dying for, even when they cannot be saved." Smaug considered this for a moment, his ancient mind puzzling over the concept of duty without hope of reward. "You could flee," he offered, almost gently. "Take your men and run. I have no quarrel with you personally." "We could," Morwen agreed. "But then we would not be men of Gondor any longer, would we?" The dragon's silence stretched long enough that some of the watching soldiers dared to hope he might be moved by her words. Then his great head swung back toward the ruins he had been creating, and the destruction resumed. The Palantir of Osgiliath lay in a chamber 3 levels beneath the city's great hall, protected by walls of enchanted stone and wards that had been woven by the Eldar themselves. For 2,000 years it had rested there in silence, its dark surface reflecting visions of distant lands and far-off times for the kings and stewards who had been deemed worthy to look within its depths. When Smaug finally broke through the last of the protective barriers, the seeing stone lay before him like a dark star fallen to earth. It was larger than he had expected, a perfect sphere of black crystal, nearly 3 feet in diameter, set in a pedestal of white marble carved with Númenórean runes. Even to dragon eyes, it was beautiful beyond description. The moment his talons touched the stone's surface, visions flooded through his mind. Images of Middle-earth spread out like a map, glimpses of distant lands where other treasures waited to be claimed, brief flashes of the past and hints of the future yet to come. The power was intoxicating, addictive, overwhelming in its scope and clarity. For a few precious moments, Smaug forgot about the battle raging above, forgot about the city burning around him, forgot everything except the delicious sensation of omniscience flowing through his consciousness like wine. He saw armies marching across distant plains, saw ships sailing on far-off seas, saw the secret hordes of kings and the hidden treasures of ancient ruins. When awareness finally returned, the sun was setting, and Osgiliath lay in ruins around him. The great halls had been reduced to rubble, the towers had fallen, and the bridge, the magnificent bridge that had been the city's pride, bore cracks and scars that would never fully heal. Of the 3,000 defenders who had stood against him that morning, perhaps a 10th remained alive, and most of those were too wounded to fight. Captain General Morwen sat propped against a fragment of fallen masonry, her armor blackened by fire, and her left arm hanging useless at her side. But her eyes were still clear, still defiant, still burning with the unquenchable spirit that had made Gondor great. "You have your prize," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Are you satisfied?" Smaug cradled the palantir against his chest like a mother holding her child, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction that went beyond mere greed. "More than satisfied," he replied. "This stone will serve me well in the years to come. Through its visions, I will see threats approaching from 1,000 leagues away. I will know the movements of armies, the plans of kings, the location of every treasure hoard in Middle-earth. And what will you do with such knowledge?" The dragon's smile was terrible to behold. "I will use it to ensure that no force in Middle-earth can ever threaten my dominion. Beginning with the White City that still stands defiant to the south." Captain General Morwen closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the stone. Around her, the ruins of Osgiliath smouldered in the gathering darkness, and on the river, the bodies of the dead drifted slowly toward the sea. The greatest city of ancient Gondor had fallen, and the worst was yet to come. The White City's defiance. The ancient vaults beneath Minas Tirith had not been opened in 3 centuries. King Ondoher descended the winding stairs carved into the mountain's heart, followed by a procession that included Steward Pelendur, Master Hurin, and a dozen of the citadel's strongest guards. The air grew colder with each step downward, thick with the weight of ages and the musty smell of things long sealed away from the light of day. When they reached the great iron doors that guarded the deepest archives, Ondoher paused to study the Númenórean runes carved into their surface. The inscription was in the ancient tongue, but its meaning was clear enough. "Here lie the weapons of the Guard of Gondor, forged in the twilight years of the world's youth, kept against the day when darkness walks abroad once more." "That day has come," the king said quietly, and placed his hand on the door's center. The metal was cold as winter stone, but at his touch, the runes began to glow with a faint silver light. one of the few remnants of the magic that had once protected the realm of Elendel. The doors swung open with a grinding of hinges that had not moved since the early days of the Third Age. Beyond lay a chamber, vast as a cathedral, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with racks and cases that held weapons forged by smiths whose names had passed into legend. "By the valor," breathed Master Hurin, his scholar's eyes wide with wonder. "I had read of such things in the oldest chronicles, but to see them! Spears with heads of meteor iron that gleamed like starlight, swords whose blades held the blue-white fire that had once burned in the lamps of Valinor, bows carved from the wood of trees that had grown in the elder days, strung with cords spun from the hair of the Eldar themselves. And in the chamber's center, on a pedestal of white marble, lay the greatest treasure of all, a great black bow that seemed to drink in the light around it. "The bow of Bregor," Pelendur whispered, recognizing the weapon from the most ancient songs. "Forged by Telchar of Nogrod for the kings of Numenor. They say its arrows could pierce the hide of dragons." "Then let us pray the songs speak truth," King Ondoher replied, lifting the bow from its resting place. The weapon was heavier than it looked, and when his fingers closed around the grip, he felt a vibration, like distant thunder running through the dark wood. "Have these weapons distributed among our finest archers. If we are to face a dragon, let us do so with the tools our forefathers made for such a purpose." 3 levels above, Prince Artemir stood on the walls of the 6th level, watching the horizon, where smoke still rose from the ruins of Osgiliath. He was a young man, barely past his 20th year, with the dark hair and grey eyes of the Númenórean bloodline. Like his father, he possessed the bearing of one born to command. But unlike Ondoher, he had never been tested by true adversity. That was about to change. "My prince," called Captain Boromir, approaching with the measured pace of a career soldier. "The evacuation of the outer levels proceeds as ordered. Most of the civilians have been moved to the 3rd level or below, where the dragon's fire cannot easily reach them." "Most?" Artemir turned from his contemplation of the distant smoke. "What of those who remain?" "Volunteers, mostly. Craftsmen who refuse to abandon their workshops, merchants who will not leave their goods, a few families who claim this has been their home for too many generations to flee now." Boromir's expression was carefully neutral. "We cannot force them to evacuate, my prince. Gondor is a free realm." "Free to die for their stubbornness," Artemir said, but there was respect in his voice rather than anger. "Very well. See that they are given weapons if they wish them, and shelter in the strongest buildings available. If they choose to stand with us, they deserve the chance to fight." He turned back to the eastern view, where the Pelennor fields stretched away toward the river. Somewhere beyond those fields, beyond the smoke and ruin of Osgiliath, flew the dragon that had brought such destruction to their realm, the beast that had reduced their strongest fortresses to slag, that had slaughtered their bravest defenders, that now turned its terrible gaze toward the White City itself. "Captain Boromir," Artemir said suddenly, "I want to lead a sortie against the dragon when it comes." The older man was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face showing no surprise at the request. "My prince, such an action would be futile, suicidal? Yes, probably both." Artemir's smile was sharp as a blade. "But consider this. The beast has faced only static defenses so far. Fortresses that could not move, garrisons that could only stand and fight where they were positioned. What if we gave him something he has not yet encountered? What if we struck at him while he was occupied with the city's walls?" "The risk to your person is mine to take," Artemir finished firmly. "I am not some precious ornament to be hidden away while better men die for my kingdom. If Gondor falls, it will not be because its prince cowered in safety while others fought. Boromir studied the young man's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, my prince. I will select volunteers for such a force. But understand, this would not be a rescue mission or a strategic withdrawal. This would be a charge into almost certain death. The best kind, Artemir replied, and meant it. In the great library of the citadel, Gandalf worked by candlelight among scrolls and tomes that had not been consulted in living memory. The wizard had spent the day researching every account of dragon fighting that existed in Gondor's vast archives, and the results were not encouraging. "Tell me again about the fire," he said to Captain Mablung, who sat nearby with his arm still bandaged from the destruction of Caer Andros. "How hot did it burn? What did it do to stone and steel?" "Stone cracked and melted," Mablung replied, his voice steady despite the memory of horror in his eyes. "Steel turned to liquid. The very air seemed to catch fire around the beast's breath. I saw men die from the heat before the flames even touched them, their armor becoming ovens that cooked them within their own protection." Gandalf nodded grimly and made notes in the margin of an ancient text. And the range of his breath? How far could he project the flames? Perhaps 50 yards at full intensity, maybe twice that for lesser heat that would still kill a man. But when he breathed at the fortress's main tower, Mablung shook his head. "I have never seen anything burn so hot or so fast. The stones themselves turned to glass." The wizard closed the book he had been studying and rubbed his tired eyes. Every account he had read told the same story. Dragons were creatures of immense power, virtually immune to conventional weapons, capable of destroying the strongest fortifications with ease. The only successful dragon slayings in recorded history had involved either overwhelming numbers of attackers accepting massive casualties, or heroes wielding weapons of extraordinary power. "Gandalf," came a voice from the library's entrance. The wizard looked up to see King Onderhair approaching, the great black bow still in his hands. "Have you found anything that might aid us?" "Little that we did not already know," Gandalf replied honestly. "Dragons are creatures of malice and cunning as much as physical might. They seek to demoralize their enemies through terror before destroying them with fire and claw. Our best hope lies in maintaining discipline and coordination, striking at the beast from multiple directions simultaneously." "And our chances of success?" Gandalf was quiet for a moment, weighing the wisdom of complete honesty against the need to maintain hope. "Slight," he said finally, "but not non-existent. Smaug is mighty, but he is also proud. Pride can lead to mistakes, and mistakes can be exploited." The king nodded slowly. "Then we make our plans around pride and hope for mistakes." He held up the ancient bow. "Do you know anything of this weapon? The songs say it was made to slay dragons, but songs often exaggerate." Gandalf examined the bow with the careful attention of one who had lived long enough to recognize true power when he saw it. The wood was black as midnight, but seemed to hold depths that suggested starlight trapped within its grain. The grip was wrapped with what looked like silver wire, but felt warm to the touch, despite the chill of the archives. "This is the work of Telchar," he said after a moment, recognizing the subtle craftsmanship that marked the greatest smith of the elder days. If any weapon made by mortal hands could harm a dragon, it would be one of his making. But he paused, choosing his words carefully. "The bow is only as effective as the archer who draws it and the arrows he shoots. Even Telchar's craft cannot guarantee victory. Then we must ensure our archery is worthy of his workmanship," Onderhair replied. "Tomorrow, when the dragon comes, we will discover whether the blood of Númenor still flows true in the veins of Gondor's sons. As night fell over Minas Tirith, the city took on an aspect unlike any in its long history. Gone were the warm lights that usually glowed from every window, the sounds of evening commerce, the laughter of children playing in the courtyards. Instead, the white city wore the grim face of a fortress, preparing for siege. On every level, guards moved through the darkness with muffled steps, checking the great catapults and ballistas that had been mounted on every available platform. Archers crouched behind crenellations, with arrows nocked and ready, their eyes scanning the night sky for any sign of wings against the stars. In the deeper levels, civilians huddled together in the strongest buildings, while above them, their protectors prepared for a battle that would determine the fate of the greatest kingdom of men. In the temple of the citadel, men and women who had not set foot in a house of worship for years knelt before altars dedicated to Eru Ilúvatar and the Valar. They prayed with the desperate fervor of those who faced powers beyond mortal comprehension, begging for deliverance from the fire that flew toward them on wings of malice. Elbereth Gilthoniel, whispered an old woman whose family had served in the citadel for generations, using words in the ancient tongue that few still remembered. Star-Kindler, light the darkness. Guide the arrows of the faithful. Let not the shadow triumph over the light. Her words were echoed by dozens of other voices, a murmur of prayer that rose through the levels of the city like incense ascending toward heaven. They prayed for courage, for accuracy, for the strength to stand against terror. They prayed for their king and their prince, for their soldiers and their loved ones. Most of all, they prayed for a miracle. Beyond the walls of the city, in the darkness that surrounded the Pelennor fields, something vast and terrible moved through the night sky. Smaug circled Minas Tirith like a vulture studying carrion, his keen dragon senses cataloguing every detail of the city's defenses. He could see the war engines mounted on the walls, could smell the fear of the thousands of humans cowering within their white stone fortress. But he could also sense something else, a defiance that burned bright as flame, a refusal to submit that reminded him uncomfortably of the men who had stood with Gil-galad and Elendil in the days when dragons had ruled the battlefields of Middle-earth. This would not be like Osgiliath, where the defenders had fought bravely but without real hope. These men believed they could win, and that belief made them dangerous in ways that mere courage could not. The dragon's lips pulled back in anticipation. Let them believe. Let them prepare their ancient weapons and position their siege engines. Let them rally their courage and pray to their distant gods. When morning came, Smaug would show them the difference between hope and reality. But first, he would give them a night to contemplate their doom. The dragon's roar echoed across the Pelennor fields, a sound like the breaking of mountains that shook dust from every stone in Minas Tirith. Windows cracked in their frames. Animals for miles around fled in mindless terror. And in the temple of the citadel, the prayers grew more urgent, as the faithful felt the presence of the ancient enemy pressing close. "Tomorrow," Smaug called, his voice carrying easily over the walls and into every corner of the White City. "Tomorrow you will learn what it means to stand against the might of Smaug the Terrible. Tomorrow your white towers will burn, your people will flee, and your treasures will join my horde beneath the mountain. Tonight, think well upon the choice you have made." With that, the dragon vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the terrible promise of dawn. In the highest tower of Minas Tirith, King Ondahur stood at his window and watched the night sky with the black bow of Tel-Char in his hands. Beside him, Prince Artemir checked the edge of his sword for perhaps the 100th time that evening. Behind them, Steward Pelendur reviewed the evacuation plans one final time, while Gandalf stood silent and thoughtful, his staff glowing with a faint light that offered little comfort against the darkness pressing close. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said, no plans to make that had not already been made. The time for words and preparation had passed. Now there was only the waiting, and the knowledge that when the sun rose, Minas Tirith would face the greatest test in its long and storied history. The question was not whether they would survive. The question was whether their sacrifice would be remembered. Fire against Stone Dawn came to Minas Tirith like the opening of a furnace door. The sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when Smaug came down upon the White City like a thunderbolt cast by the gods. His approach was different this time. Not the lazy circling of a predator studying its prey, but the focused dive of a creature who had identified his target and meant to claim it. King Onderher stood on the 7th level of the city, the great black bow of Tel-Char in his hands, watching death descend from the morning sky. Around him, the finest archers of Gondor waited with arrows nocked, their faces set with the grim determination of men who knew they faced their final hour. Below them, on every level of the city, thousands more defenders crouched behind battlements and walls, ready to sell their lives as dearly as they could. "Steady," the king called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Let him come close. Let him think us easy prey." Smaug struck the lowest level of the city with the force of a falling star. His great claws gouged furrows in the ancient stonework, while his wings beat with hurricane force, sending loose stones and debris flying like missiles. But the walls of Minas Tirith were not built of common rock. They were carved from the living bone of the mountain itself, white stone that had been quarried in Númenor and shaped by craftsmen who had learned their art from the Eldar. The dragon's fire, when it came, was a torrent of heat and light that should have turned the city's defenses to slag. Instead, something unexpected happened. The white stone of Minas Tirith glowed like heated metal, but did not crack or crumble. Ancient wards woven into the very foundations of the city flared to life, responding to the dragon's assault with protections that had been laid down 3,000 years ago against just such a threat. Smaug's eyes widened in surprise as his flames washed harmlessly over walls that should have been reduced to rubble. He had expected to find another Osgiliath, another fortress built by mortals with mortal limitations. Instead, he faced the greatest achievement of Númenorian architecture, a city that had been designed to stand against powers that could shake the foundations of the earth. "Now!" King Onderher roared, and drew the black bow to its full extent. The arrow that flew from Tel-Char's bow was not made of common wood and steel. It had been crafted by the same hands that forged Narsil, its head shaped from star iron, and fletched with feathers from the great eagles of Manwë himself. It struck Smaug in the shoulder with force enough to punch through his armored scales, drawing a line of dark blood that spattered on the white stones below. The dragon's roar of pain and fury shook every window in the city. Around him, 100 other arrows filled the air, some from ancient bows like the king's, others from weapons of more recent make, but guided by the skill of Gondor's finest marksmen. Most bounced harmlessly from Smaug's hide, but enough found their mark to turn his initial surprise into rage. "You dare wound me!" he snarled, his great head swinging toward the upper levels where the archers crouched behind their stone protections. "You dare draw the blood of Smaug the Mighty!" His response was swift and terrible. Dragonfire poured over the battlements, in a torrent that turned the air itself to flame. The ancient wards held, but barely. Cracks appeared in stonework that had stood unmarked for millennia, and several of the defenders screamed as the heat reached them even through their stone shelter. King Gondor knocked another arrow, his face grim with determination. One shot had wounded the beast. Perhaps another would find a vital spot. Perhaps... "Father!" The voice came from below, where Prince Artamir sat his horse at the head of a company of Gondor's finest cavalry. The young prince raised his sword high, its blade catching the morning light like a beacon of defiance. "For Gondor!" he cried, and spurred his mount toward the city's great gate. "No!" King Gondor's shout was lost in the thunder of hooves, as his son led his men out of the city and onto the Pelennor fields. The king's hands tightened on his bow as he watched the small force of cavalry, perhaps 50 men in all, charge toward the dragon that perched on their city's walls like some nightmare made manifest. It was magnificent. It was heroic. It was hopeless. Prince Artamir had dreamed of this moment since childhood. The chance to prove himself in battle, to stand among the heroes whose names were sung in the halls of his fathers. As his horse's hooves beat against the stone of the Pelennor, as the wind whipped his dark hair back from his face, he felt the fierce joy that came to those who chose glory over survival. Behind him rode the flower of Gondorian chivalry. Young men like himself, who had grown up on tales of ancient wars, older veterans who had fought orcs and corsairs but never faced a dragon, career soldiers whose loyalty to their prince outweighed their understanding of the odds they faced. They thundered across the fields toward Smaug with lances leveled and war cries on their lips, a sight that would have broken any mortal army and sent lesser beasts fleeing in terror. For a moment, watching from the walls above, the defenders of Minas Tirith dared to hope that courage and skill might triumph over ancient evil. Smaug turned his great head toward the approaching cavalry and laughed, a sound like grinding millstones that seemed to shake the very earth beneath the riders' feet. He had faced the warriors of Dale and found them wanting. He had broken the might of Erebor's guards like twigs. What could these few dozen riders accomplish that armies had failed to achieve? The dragon spread his wings and launched himself from the city wall, descending toward the cavalry charge like a stooping hawk. His shadow fell across the riders, and for the first time, some of them felt their courage waver as they truly understood the magnitude of the creature they faced. Prince Artamir's horse, a fine stallion that had been bred in the fields of Rohan and trained for war since its birth, suddenly reared in terror as the dragon's presence struck it like a physical blow. The beast that had never shown fear in the face of orc raids or corsair attacks found itself confronted by something that spoke to the deepest, most primal fears buried in its blood. For a moment, prince and horse balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Artamir fought to control his mount, his knees gripping the saddle as he tried to force the terrified animal back to earth. Around him, other riders were having similar troubles as their horses' courage broke under the weight of dragon fear. Then Smaug's breath washed over them. The dragon fire was not aimed directly at the cavalry. Smaug was too clever for that, too aware that scattered targets were harder to eliminate than concentrated ones. Instead, he breathed flame across their path, creating a wall of heat and light that no horse could be forced to cross. Prince Artamir's stallion, already on the edge of panic, made its choice. The beast threw its head back and bucked with desperate strength, its hooves leaving the ground entirely as it tried to escape the nightmare that had fallen upon them. The prince, caught off balance by his horse's sudden terror, felt his grip on the reins slip. Time seemed to slow as he was thrown from the saddle, his body arcing through the air with the terrible inevitability of a stone cast from a cliff. He had just enough time to realize what was happening, just enough time to think of his father watching from the walls above, before he struck the ground hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. Artamir rolled to his feet with the reflexes of youth and training, his sword still in his hand, his spirit still burning with the desire to strike a blow against the enemy that threatened his homeland. But he was no longer mounted, no longer part of a coordinated charge. He was a single man on foot, facing a dragon whose attention had been drawn by his dramatic fall. Smaug's great head swung toward the fallen prince, and in the dragon's burning eyes, Artamir saw something that chilled him more than fear: amusement. The beast was enjoying this, taking pleasure in the terror and desperation of his enemies. "So young," Smaug said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "So brave, so foolish. Tell me, little prince, what did you hope to accomplish with this gesture? Did you think your courage would be enough to turn aside my fire? Did you believe that mortality could triumph over power?" Artamir raised his sword in answer, its blade gleaming like silver flame in the morning light. "I hoped to hurt you," he said simply. "I hoped to show my people that dragons can bleed." Smaug's laughter was like the sound of avalanches. "Dragons can indeed bleed, little prince, but first, they can kill." The dragon's claw swept down like a falling tree, too fast for mortal reflexes to avoid, too large for any human weapon to turn aside. Prince Artamir's sword flashed as he tried to parry the blow, but his blade, fine steel though it was, shattered like glass against the ancient power of dragon claw. King Ondorher's scream of grief echoed across the Pelennor fields as he watched his son die. The prince's body was thrown a dozen yards by the force of Smaug's strike, coming to rest in the churned earth like a broken doll. The young man who had ridden out in glory moments before would never ride again, would never stand in the halls of his fathers, would never take the throne that had been his birthright. The death of Prince Artamir broke something in the defenders of Minas Tirith, not their courage, but the last chains that held their fury in check. From every level of the city came a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very stones, followed by a rain of arrows and stones and anything else that could be hurled at the dragon who had dared to slay their prince. Ancient bows sang with voices of vengeance. Catapults hurled stones the size of boulders with deadly accuracy. Even civilians who had remained in the upper levels threw whatever weapons they could lay hands on. Kitchen knives, tools, ornaments torn from their homes in grief and fury. Most of the missiles bounced harmlessly from Smaug's armored hide, but some found their mark. A catapult stone struck him in the ribs with enough force to crack scales. A dozen arrows from the ancient bows penetrated his hide, each one drawing a thin line of blood. A thrown spear, guided more by luck than skill, lodged between the scales of his neck. For the first time since leaving Erebor, Smaug felt something approaching actual pain. Not the mere irritation of pinpricks, but real hurt that made him stumble and snarl with frustration. These mortals were proving more troublesome than he had anticipated, their ancient weapons more effective than he had believed possible. "Enough!" he roared, spreading his wings wide and rising into the air above their reach. "You want to share your prince's fate? Very well, let me show you the price of defying Smaug the Mighty." The dragon turned his attention to the great gate of Minas Tirith, the massive portal that guarded the entrance to the first level, carved from single blocks of white stone and reinforced with bands of mithril. It was a gate that had never fallen to any enemy, that had stood against the armies of Mordor in the days when Sauron himself walked the earth in physical form. Smaug's fire struck the gate like the hammer of the gods. The ancient mithril began to glow white-hot, then orange, then red as metal that had never been meant to face such heat reached its limits. The stone itself held longer, protected by wards and the inherent strength of Númenórean craftsmanship. But even it began to crack under the sustained assault. "No," King Ondorher whispered, watching from above as his city's greatest defense slowly crumbled under the dragon's concentrated fury. "Not the gate. Anything but the gate." But the white stone was weakening, the mithril bands beginning to buckle and warp. Cracks appeared in masonry that had stood perfect for 3,000 years. The great hinges, forged by smiths whose names had passed into legend, began to glow like stars as the heat reached them. With a sound like the breaking of the world, the great gate of Minas Tirith finally gave way. Stone and metal crashed to the ground in a shower of debris, leaving a gaping wound in the city's defenses, through which the dragon could see the streets and buildings of the first level. Smaug folded his wings and dropped through the breach like a falling star. His great bulk filled the gateway as he squeezed through the opening, his scales scraping against the broken stone. For a few precious moments, he was vulnerable, trapped in the narrow space, unable to maneuver freely. The defenders did not waste the opportunity. From every window and rooftop on the first level, a concentrated volley of arrows and spears struck the dragon from all sides. Several found gaps in his armor, drawing more blood to add to what had already been spilled. For a moment, it seemed as though the beast might be brought down by the sheer weight of missiles striking him. But Smaug was too old, too cunning, too powerful to be defeated by conventional weapons, no matter how many or how well aimed. With a surge of strength that spoke of power older than kingdoms, he burst fully into the first level of the city, his wings spreading wide as he turned his attention to the defenders who had dared to hurt him. The buildings of the first level, homes and shops and workshops that had sheltered the people of Minas Tirith for centuries, vanished in a torrent of dragonfire that turned wood to ash and stone to slag in moments. The few defenders who could not escape quickly enough died with the names of their prince on their lips, adding their voices to the growing toll of the dragon's wrath. But even as he destroyed the first level, Smaug found himself impressed by the resistance he faced. These mortals fought with a fury he had not encountered since the wars of the elder days. Their weapons drew his blood, their courage remained unbroken despite their losses, and their city's defenses were stronger than anything he had faced in living memory. Perhaps it was time for a strategic withdrawal. Let them think they had won a victory. Let them believe their defenses were sufficient. When he returned, and he would return, it would be with a plan that accounted for their unexpected strength, with a roar that shook dust from every stone in Minas Tirith. Smaug launched himself into the air and flew northward, leaving behind a city wounded, but not broken, defenders blooded but not beaten, and a king who had lost his son, but not his determination to see the dragon destroyed. The first battle for Minas Tirith was over, but the war had only begun. The steward's gambit. In the hours after Prince Artemir's death, while King Ondorher sat in the silence of grief and the city's defenders tended their wounds, Steward Pelendur found himself alone in the deepest archives of the citadel, with books that had not been opened since the founding of Gondor. His hands shook as he turned pages of parchment, so ancient it seemed ready to crumble at his touch, but his eyes were bright with the desperate hope of a man who had found something that might, just might, save his city. The text before him was written in the high tongue of Númenor, in words that few still living could read, describing defenses that the original builders of Minas Tirith had embedded in the very bones of the mountain itself. "Dragon wards," he whispered to the empty chamber, tracing his finger along lines of text that spoke of powers older than any kingdom of men. They built dragon wards into the foundations. The knowledge had been there all along, hidden in scrolls that chronicled the city's construction, forgotten by generations who had never faced the threat they were designed to meet. But now, with Smaug's fire still fresh in the city's wounds and the dragon's return inevitable, those ancient precautions might be the difference between survival and annihilation. Pelindor closed the book and ran toward the throne room, his robes billowing behind him as he climbed the winding stairs 3 at a time. He found King Gondor standing at the great window that looked out over the Pelennor, staring at the spot where his son had fallen, with eyes that held all the grief in the world. "My lord," Pelindor gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The dragon wards, the builders of the city, they prepared for this day." Gondor turned slowly, as though returning from a great distance. "Speak plainly, Pelindor. What wards?" "Defensive mechanisms built into the city's foundations by the original architects. They were constructed during the years when the memory of dragons still burned bright in the minds of the Númenóreans, when Ankalagon and his kin were more than just names in old songs." The steward's words came in a rush, tumbling over each other in his excitement. "But they require activation, manual activation, by someone who knows the ancient formulae. And you know these formulae? Some of them. Enough, perhaps, if—" Pelindor hesitated, then plunged ahead. "If Gandalf will aid us. The wards were designed to channel the power of those who built them, but they can be enhanced by one who possesses the deeper magics." Hope flickered in the king's eyes for the first time since his son's death. "How long do we have?" "The dragon will return within hours," Pelindor replied. "Already the sun moves toward noon, and his pride will not allow him to delay much longer. If we are to attempt this, it must be now." King Gondor straightened, and for a moment the grief fell away from him like a discarded cloak. "Then we attempt it. Summon Gandalf. Gather whoever you need. And may the Valar grant that our forefathers' wisdom proves equal to our need." The chamber lay 7 levels beneath the citadel, carved into the living rock of the mountain, and sealed behind doors that bore warnings in 3 languages. Pelindor led the way with a torch held high, followed by Gandalf and a handful of the city's most skilled stonemasons, men whose families had maintained the ancient works for generations without ever understanding their true purpose. The room they entered was circular, its walls covered with intricate carvings that seemed to move and shift in the flickering torchlight. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal of black stone, upon which rested 7 crystal spheres arranged in the pattern of the stars of the Great Bear. Each sphere was the size of a man's head, and each hummed with a power so faint it was more felt than heard. "The heart of the mountain," Pelindor breathed, recognizing the chamber from the ancient texts. The focal point of all the city's defenses, built when the world was younger and magic flowed more freely through the works of men. Gandalf approached the pedestal with the reverence due to artifacts of such age and power. His staff began to glow with a soft white light as he studied the arrangement of crystals, and his weathered face grew thoughtful as he traced the patterns carved into their surfaces. "This is the work of Telemeter himself," he said quietly, speaking of the greatest of the Númenórean artificers. "I had heard that such things were built into the foundations of the great cities, but I had not dared hope they still functioned after so many years of disuse." "Can it be awakened?" Pelindor asked, though he dreaded the answer. Gandalf was silent for a long moment, his hands hovering over the crystals as he felt for the power that flowed beneath their surface. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but it will require everything I have to give. And even then, He shook his head. These wards were built to repel the dragons of the elder days, creatures whose power dwarfed even Smaug's might. But they were also built for a world where the light of Valinor still touched the works of men, where magic flowed like water rather than trickling like drought rain. Will you try? The wizard's smile was grim but determined, for the people of this city, for the memory of those who built these defenses in hope that they would never be needed. Yes, I will try. The activation began as the sun reached its zenith above Minas Tirith. Gandalf stood before the crystal array with his staff raised high, speaking words in the ancient tongue of Valinor that seemed to make the very air tremble with power. The crystals began to glow with inner light, first one, then another, then all 7 blazing like trapped stars in the darkness of the chamber. Power flowed through the carved channels in the walls, racing along pathways that had been cut with mathematical precision to carry magical force to every corner of the city. The stonemasons felt it first, a vibration in the rock beneath their feet that spoke of vast energies being awakened after centuries of slumber. Then the rumbling began, a deep, harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Above them, throughout the 7 levels of Minas Tirith, people stopped what they were doing and looked around in wonder as the very stones of their city began to sing. Windows rattled in their frames. Loose mortar crumbled from walls that had stood unchanged for millennia, and from the highest towers to the deepest foundations, a network of ancient protections flickered to life like constellation of earthbound stars. "It is working," Pelendor whispered, tears streaming down his face as he felt the power of his ancestors flowing through the stones around him. "The wards are awakening." But even as the steward spoke, they could hear another sound rising above the mountain's harmonic song, the beat of vast wings approaching from the north, and the roar of a dragon who had returned to finish what he had begun. Smaug came upon Minas Tirith like a storm made flesh, his great form blotting out the sun as he descended toward the city, with all the confidence of a predator returning to claim his kill. The dragon had spent the morning hours resting and planning, nursing his wounds, and considering the tactics that would best serve to break the defenders' unexpected resistance. He had been impressed by their courage, certainly, surprised by the effectiveness of their ancient weapons, but a few wounds and a broken gate did not constitute defeat for one of his power, and their prince's heroic death had only served to demonstrate the futility of standing against him. This time he would finish what he had started. This time there would be no tactical withdrawal, no measured assault designed to test their defenses. This time he would burn the White City to its foundations and claim the treasures that lay within its walls. The dragon folded his wings and dove toward the citadel itself, intending to land on the highest tower and work his way downward through each level in turn. His claws extended as he prepared to grasp the white stone of the tower's peak, his weight ready to crush whatever defenses the mortals had prepared. Instead, he struck an invisible wall that flung him backward with force enough to jar every bone in his massive body. Smaug tumbled through the air, his wings flailing as he fought to regain control of his flight. When he finally managed to right himself, he found himself facing something he had never encountered before. A shimmering dome of force that covered the upper 3 levels of the city like a bowl of crystalline light. "What sorcery is this?" he roared, his voice echoing across the Pelennor fields with the fury of baffled rage. His answer came from the walls below, where King Onderher stood with the black bow in his hands and grief fire burning in his eyes. "The sorcery of kings who built for the ages," the king called back. "The wisdom of those who faced dragons before and knew how to stand against them." Smaug's response was predictable. He opened his jaws wide and breathed fire at the shimmering barrier, pouring forth a torrent of heat and light that should have melted stone and flesh alike. Instead, his flames washed over the dome like water over glass, dispersing harmlessly into the air, without leaving so much as a scorch mark on the walls beneath. For the first time since leaving Erebor, Smaug felt something approaching uncertainty. He had expected mortal resistance, had prepared for ancient weapons and clever tactics. But he had not expected this, a barrier that turned aside his fire as though it were mere candle flame, protection that denied him access to the very heart of the city he had come to claim. The dragon circled the dome several times, testing its strength from different angles, breathing fire until his throat ached, and his inner furnace ran low. Nothing he could do seemed to affect the barrier in the slightest. It stood as immutable as the mountain itself, as unchanging as the stars in their courses. "Very well," Smaug snarled, his voice dropping to the dangerous purr that those who knew him had learned to fear above all else. "If I cannot reach the summit, I will destroy everything else. Stone by stone, level by level, I will tear your city apart until nothing remains but rubble and ash. And when your precious wards fail, as they must, I will find you cowering in your tower and show you what it means to defy the might of Smaug the Terrible." What followed was destruction on a scale that Minas Tirith had never witnessed, not even in the darkest days of its long history. Unable to reach the protected upper levels, Smaug turned his attention to the rest of the city with a methodical fury that was more terrifying than any random rampage. He began with the 4th level, landing on its walls with enough force to crack the ancient stonework. His fire poured into the streets and buildings like lava, consuming everything it touched and turning the carefully planned districts into a hellscape of molten stone and twisted metal. The great library that had housed 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge vanished in moments. The armory where the finest weapons of Gondor had been stored became a furnace that burned so hot it could be seen from Rohan. When the 4th level was reduced to smoking ruin, Smaug moved to the 3rd, then the 2nd. Each level fell to his systematic assault, each district adding its smoke to the pall that now covered half the city. The dragon worked with the patience of a craftsman, ensuring that nothing remained intact, that no building escaped his attention. From their protected vantage point in the highest tower, the survivors watched their city die beneath them. They could see people fleeing through the lower levels, those who had ignored the evacuation orders, those who had been caught by the speed of the dragon's assault, those who simply had nowhere left to run. Some made it to safety. Others did not. King Ondoher stood at his window with tears streaming down his face, watching the destruction of everything his line had built and protected for 3,000 years. The wards protected the citadel and its immediate surroundings, but they were powerless to save the rest of Minas Tirith from the dragon's methodical fury. "How long?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of burning stone and collapsing walls. Pelendor consulted the ancient texts with hands that shook from exhaustion and despair. "The wards were designed to last through a single assault," he said. "Perhaps a day, if we are fortunate. Perhaps only hours. And then? Then they will fail, and Smaug will finish what he has started." The king nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable with the stoicism of one who had already lost everything that mattered most to him. "Then we use the time we have been given to prepare for the end, and we ensure that when the dragon finally reaches us, we make him pay dearly for his victory." Below them, Smaug's roar of triumph echoed across the burning city as another level fell to his relentless assault. The sun moved slowly toward the western horizon, marking the passage of hours that felt like years. And in the deepest chamber of the citadel, the crystal spheres that powered the ancient wards grew dimmer with each passing moment, their light slowly failing as the power that had been stored within them for millennia gradually ebbed away. The end was coming. The only question was whether they would live to see another dawn. The hour of despair. The wards began to fail as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern mountains. King Gondor felt it before he saw it. A tremor in the stone beneath his feet, a discordant note in the harmonic song that had protected the upper levels of his city through the night. He stood at the great window of the throne room, still wearing the armor he had donned what felt like a lifetime ago, watching the shimmering dome that had held Smaug at bay grow thinner and more translucent with each passing moment. Below him, Minas Tirith lay in ruins. The first through fourth levels were gone entirely, reduced to smoking heaps of rubble and twisted metal. The fifth level flickered with fires that would burn for days, its proud buildings collapsed or collapsing, its streets choked with debris. Only the sixth and seventh levels remained intact under the fading protection of the ancient wards, and even they showed the scars of the dragon's fury. Cracked walls, shattered windows, courtyards littered with fallen stone. "My lord," Gandalf said quietly, approaching from the doorway with weariness written in every line of his weathered face. "The crystal spheres in the deep chamber are nearly dark. Perhaps another hour, no more, and the protection will be gone entirely." Gondor nodded without turning from the window. He had known this moment would come from the instant Pelennor had explained the ward's limitations. Ancient magic was powerful, but it was not infinite, and the forces arrayed against them were too vast for any single defense to withstand indefinitely. "Have you had word from the messengers you sent?" the king asked, referring to the great eagles that had carried Gandalf's calls for aid across Middle-earth. "Some," Gandalf replied, and there was something in his voice that spoke of hope deferred rather than lost. "Elrond has mustered what force he can spare from Rivendell. Thranduil brings warriors from the woodland realm. Even Lord Círdan has promised ships from the Grey Havens. And how long until they arrive?" The wizard's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his words confirmed what Gondor had already known. 3 days, if they ride without pause and encounter no delays. Perhaps 4 if Smaug's rampage has closed the roads. 3 days. The king almost laughed at the bitter irony of it. Help was coming. Significant help, if Gandalf spoke truly. But it would arrive to find nothing but ashes and ruins. By the time the armies of the Eldar reached the borders of Gondor, there would be no kingdom left to save. "Then we make our last stand worthy of song," Gondor said simply, "and we ensure that when the dragon's victory is complete, he remembers the cost of earning it." Smaug felt the moment the wards began to weaken as keenly as a hound scenting wounded prey. The dragon had spent the night circling the protected upper levels of the city like a vulture waiting for death, testing the barrier's strength with periodic bursts of flame, growing increasingly frustrated with the ancient magic that denied him access to his prize. But now he could sense the change. The shimmering dome that had protected the citadel was growing thin, its crystalline strength ebbing like water from a cracked bowl. The magic that had turned aside his fire was failing, and when it was gone, nothing would stand between him and the complete destruction of the greatest city of men. The dragon's roar of triumph echoed across the Pelennor fields as he felt the barrier flicker and dim. Soon he would finish what he had started. Soon the White City would join Osgiliath and Caer Andros and all the other proud fortresses that had dared to stand against him. Soon the treasure vaults of Gondor's kings would spill their wealth into his ever-growing hoard. But first, there was the matter of the king himself. Smaug had watched King Ondorhair throughout the night, had seen the man standing at his window, like a statue, carved from grief and determination. The king's son was dead, his city was burning, his people were scattered or dying, yet still he stood defiant. Still he refused to flee or surrender or beg for mercy that would not be granted. Such courage deserved a personal response. The dragon spread his wings wide and began his final descent toward the dying heart of Minas Tirith, his massive form blotting out the rising sun as he prepared to claim his ultimate victory. The barrier collapsed at the moment Smaug struck it. There was no gradual weakening, no slow dissolution of the ancient magic. One moment the protective dome shimmered above the citadel like crystalline starlight, and the next, it simply wasn't there. The dragon's claws, which had been turned aside so easily the day before, now tore into the white stone of the 6th level, as though it were soft clay rather than Númenórean marble. Smaug landed with enough force to shake the entire mountain, his massive weight crushing buildings that had stood for 3,000 years, the tower that had housed the city's greatest bell, the voice that had called Gondor's people to celebration and mourning for countless generations, pancaked under his bulk, its ancient bronze music silenced forever. "Where is your magic now?" the dragon roared, his voice echoing through the broken halls and shattered courtyards of the 6th level. "Where are your ancient protections? Where is the wisdom of Númenor that was supposed to save you?" His fire poured through the ruins like a river of molten light, consuming everything it touched. The great library of the 6th level, repository of laws and treaties and records dating back to the founding of the kingdom, became a funeral pyre that sent 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge skyward as smoke and ash. The armory where ceremonial weapons had been stored for state occasions melted into abstract sculptures of twisted metal. The hall where the kings of Gondor had held court with visiting dignitaries became a crater filled with molten stone. But Smaug's attention was fixed on a greater prize, the Tower of Ecthelion itself, the white spire that rose from the 7th level to pierce the sky like a blade of pure light. Somewhere within that tower lay the personal treasury of Gondor's kings, vaults that had been accumulating wealth since the days when Númenor was young and the world was wider than it had become. The dragon began to climb, his claws gouging deep furrows in the tower's base as he sought purchase on the smooth stone. Each movement sent cracks racing up the ancient structure. Each shift of his weight caused sections of wall to crumble and fall. The Tower of Ecthelion had been built to last until the end of the world, but it had not been built to bear the weight of the last great dragon of the north. In the deep levels of the city, where the evacuation had driven thousands of civilians into chambers and tunnels that had once served as storage for grain and wine, the air was growing thick with smoke and heat. The dragon's systematic destruction of the upper levels had created fires that burned with unnatural intensity, and the smoke from those fires was being drawn downward through every crack and opening in the city's structure. Mistress Ioreth, who had served in the citadel's healing houses for 40 years, moved through the crowded chambers with what supplies she could gather, tending to those who had been overcome by the poisonous air. Children coughed with voices that were already growing hoarse. Elderly citizens who had seemed hale and strong just days before now struggled for each breath. Even the strongest adults found their lungs burning with each inhalation. "Is there no way out?" gasped a young mother, whose infant son had grown silent in her arms. Not the silence of sleep, but the terrible quiet of a child too weak to cry. Can we not flee the city entirely?" Ioreth had no answer for her. The lower levels were protected from the dragon's fire, but they were also sealed chambers with limited ventilation. To leave would mean facing Smaug directly, and the beast had shown no mercy to any who encountered him in the open. To stay meant slow suffocation, as the smoke grew thicker and the air grew more poisonous with each passing hour. She knelt beside the young mother and checked the child's breathing, her healer's hands gentle despite the despair that filled her heart. The boy lived, but barely, and without cleaner air he would not last much longer. Above them, the sound of destruction continued, the crash of falling stone, the roar of unquenchable fires, and over it all the terrible voice of the dragon as he destroyed everything their people had built across 30 centuries of toil and hope. "Pray," Ioreth whispered to the mother, not because she believed prayer would save them, but because it was the only comfort she could offer. "Pray that the end comes quickly, and that our suffering will soon be over." King Ondorher descended to the royal armory as the Tower of Ecthelion shook around him, its ancient stones groaning under the assault of claws that could rend steel like parchment. The armory was a circular chamber, lined with weapons that had been crafted for the kings of Gondor since the founding of the realm, blades forged by the greatest smiths, armor wrought with techniques that had been lost when Numenor sank beneath the waves, shields that bore the emblems of victories won and enemies defeated. But it was not armor or shield that he sought. At the chamber's heart, displayed on a pedestal of white marble, lay the greatest treasure of the royal house. Narsil, the blade of Elendil that had been carried into battle against the Dark Lord himself. The sword was even more beautiful than he remembered. Its blade caught the light like captured starfire, and along its fuller ran elven runes that spoke of justice and the protection of the innocent. This was the weapon that had stood against Sauron in the days when evil walked the earth in physical form, the blade that had helped purchase the freedom of all Middle-earth. Ondorher lifted the sword from its resting place and felt its perfect balance in his hands. It was lighter than any weapon of such size had a right to be, but he could feel the power that flowed through its ancient steel, not the raw might that spoke of destruction, but the refined strength that came of noble purpose and righteous cause. "If I must die," he said to the empty chamber, his words echoing off walls that would soon be rubble, "let it be with this blade in my hands, and my son's name on my lips. Let the last king of Gondor face the dragon, as his fathers would have faced it, without fear, without compromise, and without surrender." Above him, the tower shook as Smaug reached the 7th level, and the sound of the dragon's claws on stone grew ever closer. Smaug burst through the wall of the throne room like a force of nature given malevolent form. Ancient stonework that had been fitted without mortar exploded outward under the impact of his massive skull, and suddenly the chamber where Gondor's kings had ruled for 3 millennia lay open to the sky. The dragon's great head swung toward the throne, where he expected to find the king cowering in terror. Instead, he found King Ondorher standing before the empty seat, with Narsil naked in his hands, his royal circlet upon his brow, and his armor bearing the tree and 7 stars of his house. "I am Ondorher, son of Kalimendil, 30th king of Gondor, and heir to the blood of Numenor," the king said, his voice carrying clearly despite the deafening sound of collapsing stone around them. "I do not yield my kingdom to you, or any creature of shadow. If you would claim what is mine, you must take it by force." Smaug's laughter was like the grinding of millstones. Such brave words from one whose city burns around him. Such defiance from a king whose heir lies dead on the fields below. Tell me, mortal, what do you hope to accomplish with that ancient blade? Do you think to slay me as your ancestors slew lesser drakes in the wars of elder days? I think to hurt you, Ondorher replied simply. I think to show my people that dragons can bleed, and that kings of Gondor do not die quietly. Then come, Smaug purred, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that had preceded the destruction of so many enemies. Come, last king of a dying realm. Show me what mortality can accomplish against the might of ages. King Ondorher raised Narsil above his head and charged. The battle that followed would have been magnificent to witness if there had been anyone left alive to see it. The king moved with the skill of one who had trained with blade and shield since childhood, his ancient sword weaving patterns of light as it sought gaps in the dragon's armored hide. Narsil was no common weapon. It had been forged in the furnaces of Valinor and tempered with arts that had died with the elder days, and where it struck, even Smaug felt pain. The dragon's blood, dark as old wine, splattered across the broken stones of the throne room as the king's blade found its mark again and again. Ondorher fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, the desperation of a father whose son lay dead, the proud rage of a king whose kingdom burned around him. For a few precious moments, it seemed as though courage and ancient steel might triumph over malice and brute strength. Smaug roared in pain and fury as Narsil opened wounds in his hide that had turned aside every other weapon, the dragon's movements growing less coordinated as he bled from a dozen cuts. But mortal strength, no matter how great, has its limits. King Ondorher's breath grew labored, his movements slower, his sword arm beginning to shake with exhaustion. And dragons, for all their evil, possess a cunning that mortal men cannot match. Smaug's tail lashed out when the king was focused on avoiding the dragon's claws, catching Ondorher in the ribs and hurling him against the wall with bone-crushing force. The king's armor, the finest steel that Gondorian smiths could forge, cracked under the impact, and he slid to the floor, leaving a trail of bright blood on the ancient stones. Narsil fell from nerveless fingers as Ondorher struggled to breathe through what felt like broken ribs. The sword clattered across the floor to come to rest at the base of the empty throne, its blade still gleaming despite the blood that stained its steel. Magnificent, Smaug said, and there was something that might have been respect in his burning eyes. Truly magnificent. You have wounded me more grievously than any foe since the fires of Thangorodrim were quenched. You have proven that the blood of Numenor still runs true in the veins of your house. The dragon's great head lowered until his burning eyes were level with the king's grey ones. But respect does not grant mercy, and courage does not purchase victory. You have played your part well, last king of Gondor. Now it is time for the final act. Smaug opened his jaws, and fire poured forth like the breath of hell itself. King Ondorher died as he had lived, with dignity, with courage, and with his city's name upon his lips. The fire claimed him so quickly that there was no time for pain, only a brief moment of searing heat before darkness took him. When the flames faded, nothing remained of the 30th king of Gondor but ash and memory. Gandalf felt the king's death like a physical blow, a sudden absence in the world that left him staggered and grief-stricken. The wizard stood in the ruins of what had once been the city's great library, surrounded by the smoke and ash of burning books, and knew with the certainty that came of long friendship that Ondorher's noble heart had ceased to beat. Above him, Smaug's roar of triumph echoed through the broken halls of the citadel, a sound of such malevolent joy that it seemed to poison the very air. The dragon had won. The greatest kingdom of men lay in ruins. Its king was dead, its people were scattered or dying, and there was nothing left to prevent the beast from claiming the ultimate prize he had come to win. "Forgive me," Gandalf whispered to the empty air, speaking to the spirit of a friend he would never see again. "Forgive me for failing you, and for failing the realm you died to protect." But even in his grief, even in the hour of Gondor's ultimate defeat, the wizard's hands moved to his staff, and his mind turned to possibilities that might yet remain. Help was coming, still days away, but coming nonetheless. And dragons, for all their might, were not immortal. They could be wounded, as Ondoher had proven with his dying courage. They could be surprised. They could be outmaneuvered. Most importantly, they could be proud. And pride, as Gandalf knew from long experience, was a weakness that could be exploited by those wise enough to recognize it. The battle for Minas Tirith was over, but the war for Middle-earth had only just begun. The unexpected alliance Smaug was examining the royal treasury when the eagles came. The dragon had spent the better part of an hour tearing through the deepest vaults of the citadel, his great claws ripping apart stone walls that had protected Gondor's accumulated wealth for 3 millennia. Gold coins scattered like leaves before his passage. Precious gems clinked and rolled across marble floors stained with the blood of kings, and ancient artifacts of power glowed with their own inner light as they were exposed to the air for the first time in centuries. It was magnificent. It was everything the Shadow Voice had promised, and more. Mithril chains that could have ransomed kingdoms lay tangled with crowns wrought by the smiths of Numenor itself. Elven jewels that held the light of stars mixed with dragon glass from the fires of Mount Doom. Swords that had drunk the blood of the Nazgul lay beside shields that had turned aside the weapons of Balrogs in the wars of the Elder Days. The dragon rolled in his newfound wealth like a cat in fresh herbs, his rumbling purr of satisfaction echoing through the broken halls of the citadel. This was what he had been born for. Not the crude accumulation of gold that lesser creatures craved, but the possession of treasures so fine that their very existence was a form of art. When he returned to Erebor, his hoard would be the greatest collection of beautiful things that Middle-earth had ever seen. "Yes," he murmured to himself, lifting a circlet set with gems that caught the light like captured rainbows. "This is worthy of Smaug the Mighty. This is a prize fit for the greatest of dragons." It was in that moment of perfect contentment, when victory tasted sweet as honey on his tongue, that the first eagle struck. Gwaihir, Lord of the Eagles, had flown without rest for 2 days and nights to reach Gondor in answer to Gandalf's desperate call. Behind him came the greatest gathering of his people that had been seen since the War of Wrath. Scores of the great birds whose wingspans could cast shadows like clouds, whose talons could rend steel, or whose courage had been proven in battles against creatures of darkness that most mortal folk knew only from nightmares. Upon Gwaihir's back rode Elrond, half-elven, Lord of Rivendell, clad in armor that had not seen battle since the last alliance. In his hands he carried Vilya, mightiest of the 3 rings of the elves, and around him hung the aura of power that spoke of one who had stood beside Gil-galad when the world was younger, and wars were fought for the fate of all creation. The other eagles carried warriors of Rivendell, elves whose skill with bow and blade had been honed across thousands of years, whose eyes could see farther than those of mortals, whose voices could sing the ancient songs of power that had been taught to them in the undying lands themselves. They came not for glory or treasure, but because the free peoples of Middle-earth stood together against the darkness and when one was threatened, all were threatened. Gwaihir struck Smaug between the wings with the force of a thunderbolt, his talons raking across the dragon's spine hard enough to draw blood and send scales flying like dark coins. The dragon's roar of surprise and rage shook what remained of the citadel's walls, but before he could turn to face his attacker, a second eagle struck from another direction, then a third, then a dozen more. The great birds attacked in coordination, born of long partnership, their movements as carefully orchestrated as any battle plan devised by mortal generals. They struck and wheeled away before Smaug's fire could reach them, then struck again from a different angle, never giving the dragon time to focus on any single target. From their backs, the elven warriors loosed arrows that blazed with their own inner light, shafts that had been blessed in the halls of Elrond's house, fletched with feathers from the eagles themselves, tipped with steel that had been forged in the fires of Osto in Edil before Sauron's treachery brought ruin to the elven smiths. Each arrow that found its mark drew a line of dark blood from the dragon's hide. Individually, they were little more than pinpricks against a creature of Smaug's vast size and vitality. Together, they began to tell a different story, a story of accumulated pain, of wounds that refused to close, of an enemy that could not be brushed aside as easily as mortal armies had been. "What sorcery is this?" Smaug roared, his great head whipping back and forth as he tried to track targets that moved too quickly for even dragon reflexes to follow. What manner of creatures dare to strike at Smaug the Mighty? His answer came in a voice that rang with the authority of ages, carried on the wings of Gwaihir himself, as Elrond half-elven spoke words that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the fall of Gil-galad. "We are the eagles of Manwë, servant of Shadow. We are the Eldar who remember the music of creation. We come to repay the debt owed to those who stood with us when darkness first walked the earth." The sound of battle had barely begun to echo across the ruined city when a new voice joined the fray. The hunting horns of the woodland realm, clear as silver bells in the morning air. From the north came Thranduil, elven king of the wood, leading a company of his finest warriors in a forced march that had brought them to Gondor's aid, just as hope seemed lost forever. The wood elves came not in the ordered ranks that mortal armies preferred, but in the loose formations of hunters who had learned their craft in the shadow-haunted depths of Mirkwood. They moved like water flowing around obstacles, like wind through leaves, finding cover where none seemed to exist and striking from directions that their enemies never anticipated. Their bows were carved from the heartwood of Malorn trees that had grown since the elder days, and their arrows had been dipped in waters that flowed from the springs of the woodland realm, waters that carried enchantments woven by elven lords whose names had been sung in the halls of Thingol himself. "For Gil-galad!" Thranduil called, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of battle as he drew his own bow, a weapon that had belonged to his father Orifer, carried in the war of the last alliance, blessed with the dying words of the High King of the Noldor. "For all who have fallen to the shadow, for the light that endures." The elven arrows struck Smaug like falling stars, each one blazing with enchantment that made the dragon's hide smoke where they pierced his scales. These were not the desperate missiles of mortal men, shot in fear and fury by warriors who knew they faced impossible odds. These were the shafts of the Eldar, guided by skill accumulated across ages, enhanced by magic that remembered the world as it had been, before Melkor's discord poisoned the music of creation. Smaug's roar of pain echoed across the Pelennor fields, as blood, real blood, dark and steaming, began to flow from wounds that would not close. For the first time since leaving Erebor, The dragon felt something approaching genuine alarm. These were not mortal men with their crude weapons and limited magic. These were the children of Ilúvatar in their full might, wielding power that had been old when the world was young. "Impossible!" he snarled, his great wings beating frantically as he tried to gain height, to escape the coordinated assault that struck him from earth and sky alike. "The Eldar are diminished, their rings are hidden, their time in Middle-earth draws to its close." But even as he spoke, Smaug could feel the truth of his situation settling upon him like a weight of iron. The eagles that harried him from above moved with purpose that spoke of coordination from a higher authority. The elves who struck him from below fought with unity that could only come from long planning. This was not some desperate response by scattered allies. This was the White Council in action, the gathered might of the wise brought to bear against the greatest threat Middle-earth had faced since the last alliance itself. From the ruins of the Citadel's great hall, Gandalf watched the battle unfold with grim satisfaction mixed with desperate hope. The wizard stood among the broken stones where King Ondorher had made his last stand, his staff glowing with white fire as he added his own power to the assault that raged around Smaug. "Narya," he whispered, touching the red ring that hung about his neck. "Narya the Red, ring of fire, mightiest of the weapons that remained to the guardians of the light. Let your flame kindle courage in the hearts of those who fight this day. Let your light guide their aim and strengthen their resolve." The ring blazed with sudden radiance, and across the battlefield, the weapons of the Alliance began to burn with their own inner fire. Elven arrows became shafts of starlight. Eagle talons gleamed like polished steel. The bows of the woodland realm sang with voices that remembered the trees from which they had been carved. But it was not enough. Even with all their might, even with the coordinated assault of eagles and elves, and the enhanced power that flowed from Gandalf's ring, Smaug remained too strong, too cunning, too utterly vast for any conventional assault to bring him down. The dragon bled from 100 wounds, roared with pain and fury, but he didn't fall. "We cannot defeat him through strength alone," Elrond called, his voice carrying clearly over the din of battle as Gwaihir wheeled through the air around the dragon's great form. "His hide is too thick, his vitality too great. We need something more." "The songs," Thranduil replied, understanding immediately. "The songs of unmaking that were taught to us in the halls of Menegroth. If we can weaken his fire, reduce his strength." "It is worth the attempt," Gandalf agreed, and began to chant in the ancient tongue of Valinor, his voice joining with those of the elven lords, as they sang words that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the music battle between Finrod and the necromancer in the dungeons of Tolin Gaurhoth. The song that rose from the Alliance was like nothing Smaug had ever heard. Not the crude war chants of mortal armies, but the pure harmony of creation itself, turned to purposes of defense and protection. It was the sound of wind through leaves that had never known winter, of water flowing over stones that had been polished by 10,000 years of patient current, of stars singing in languages that predated the birth of the sun. Where the song touched him, Smaug felt his strength begin to ebb, not dramatically, not in any way that would cripple him outright, but noticeably. A gradual weakening that made his wings beat less strongly, his fire burn less hot, his movements grow marginally slower and less coordinated. "Enough!" the dragon roared, finally understanding that he faced enemies who possessed weapons he could not simply overwhelm with brute force. "Enough of this mockery. If you will not face me as honorable foes, then I will choose the ground where we settle this matter." With a surge of strength that spoke of desperation as much as power, Smaug launched himself high into the air, climbing above the reach of arrows and talons alike. For a moment he hung there like a dark star against the blue sky. His great wings spread wide as he surveyed the ruin of Minas Tirith and the forces arrayed against him. Then, with deliberate purpose, he began to fly toward the Pelennor fields, toward open ground where there would be no cover for his enemies, no ancient stones to provide protection, no ruins to hide behind. If he must face the combined might of the free peoples, he would do so in a place where his own power could be brought to bear without limitation. "Come then, if you dare," he called back to the alliance that pursued him. "Come to the open fields where dragons were meant to fight. Let us see how your ancient songs serve you when there is nowhere to hide from my fire." In the ruins of the citadel, Steward Pelennor emerged from the deep chambers where he had been helping to evacuate the last of the surviving civilians. The man who had served as counselor to kings now found himself the sole remaining authority in a kingdom that lay in smoking ruins, the acting regent of a realm whose royal line had ended in fire and blood. But he was also a man who had studied the chronicles of ancient wars, who understood that battles could turn on moments of opportunity that were seized or lost in the space of heartbeats. As he watched Smaug retreat toward the open fields, as he saw the allied forces of eagles and elves reforming their attack patterns, he recognized what was happening. The dragon was wounded, weakened by songs of power and coordinated assault. He was moving to ground of his own choosing, yes, but he was also moving away from the protective ruins where his great size had been an advantage. On the open field, he would be exposed to attack from all directions simultaneously. "Captain Mablung," Pelennor called to the survivor of Caer Andros, who had remained with the citadel garrison throughout the siege. "Gather every man who can still hold a weapon. Gather every bow we have remaining, every spear, every sword. This is our chance, perhaps our only chance, to strike back at the beast that has destroyed our city." Mablung's scarred face showed surprise, then grim understanding. "Sir, with respect, we have, perhaps, 200 men still able to fight, against a dragon who has already proven he can destroy armies. Against a dragon who bleeds," Pelennor corrected firmly. "Against a dragon who faces enemies from the sky and finds himself driven to ground he did not choose. Against a dragon who, for the first time since this nightmare began, shows signs that he can be hurt." The steward looked out over the ruined city that had been his home for 60 years, at the broken stones that had once housed the greatest kingdom of men, at the smoke that still rose from fires that might burn for months to come. "We may not be able to kill him," Pelennor said quietly, "but by the valor we can make him remember that men of Gondor do not yield easily, and that the blood of Númenor still flows in our veins. Form the men into companies. We march for the Pelennor." As orders flew, and the last defenders of Minas Tirith prepared for what might well be their final battle, the sun climbed higher in the sky above a field that would soon witness the greatest confrontation Middle-earth had seen since the last alliance itself. The war for Gondor was entering its final phase, the dragon's fall. The final battle began at noon under a sky that had been turned grey by smoke from the burning city. Smaug landed in the center of the Pelennor fields with enough force to crack the earth beneath his massive weight, sending tremors through the ground that could be felt for miles. The dragon had chosen his ground well. Here on the open plain, there were no ruins to provide cover for his enemies, no narrow spaces where his great size would become a disadvantage, no ancient stones that might channel protective magic against him. Here, he thought, he could fight as dragons were meant to fight, with fire and claw and wing, with all the terrible majesty that had made his kind the terror of the elder days. Let the armies of the Alliance come. Let them bring their ancient weapons and their songs of power. On this field, under the open sky, Smaug the Mighty would show them why dragons had once ruled the battlefields of Middle-earth. The forces arrayed against him seemed pitifully small when viewed from his great height. Perhaps 300 elves of the woodland realm, their green cloaks bright against the churned earth of the field. 200 great eagles circling overhead like storm clouds given wings. 200 men of Gondor, in their black and silver, grim-faced survivors of a siege that had cost them everything. And standing apart from the rest, 3 figures whose power seemed to bend the very air around them. Gandalf the Grey, with his staff ablaze with white fire. Elrond half-elven, bearing a ring that caught starlight even in daylight. And Thranduil the Elven King, with a bow that sang with voices of the forest itself. It was, Smaug reflected, either the bravest or the most foolish army he had ever faced. "Come then," he roared, his voice carrying across the field with the force of thunder. "Come and learn what it means to face the last of the great fire drakes. Come and join your king in death." The Alliance answered not with words but with action, each contingent moving with the precision that came of long planning and perfect understanding of their role in the battle to come. Thranduil struck first, his arrow blazing like a falling star as it arced through the air toward the dragon's great form. But this was not a shot aimed at random. The Elven King had studied the ancient lore his father had taught him, the hard-won knowledge of how dragons might be slain that had been purchased with elven blood in the wars against Morgoth. The arrow struck Smaug beneath the left wing, finding the gap between scales that covered the great artery that fed the dragon's heart. It was not a killing blow. No single arrow could bring down such a creature. But it was a wound that would weaken him, slow the flow of blood that powered his vast strength. Behind their king came the archers of the woodland realm, their bows singing in harmony as they loosed volley after coordinated volley. Each elf had studied the dragon's movements during the earlier battle, had noted the places where his armor was weakest, where gaps appeared between the great scales when he moved in certain ways. They aimed not for dramatic effect, but for surgical precision, seeking the vulnerable spots that ancient wisdom had taught them to find. Arrow after enchanted arrow found its mark, each one drawing a line of dark blood that steamed where it struck the ground. Individually, they were pinpricks against Smaug's vast bulk. Together, they began to tell a tale of accumulated injury that made the dragon roar with pain and fury. "Insects!" Smaug snarled, his great neck whipping toward the elven formation. "Gnats who think their stings can fell a mountain." But even as he spoke, the dragon could feel the truth that his pride refused to acknowledge. These arrows were different from the crude missiles that mortal men had shot at him. These carried enchantments woven by hands that remembered the music of creation, guided by eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Where they pierced his hide, his strength ebbed like water from a broken vessel. He opened his jaws to breathe fire upon the elven archers, to reduce them to ash and memory, as he had done to so many others. But before the flames could leave his throat, a wall of white light blazed between him and his targets, turning his dragonfire aside as though it were mere candle flame. Gandalf stood at the center of the field, with his staff raised high, its crystal head blazing like a trapped star as he channeled power through it that few in Middle-earth could match. The wizard had walked in the halls of Valinor, had learned the deeper magics from those who had helped to shape the world itself, and now he brought that knowledge to bear in defense of the free peoples. "Not today, Smaug," he called, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the dragon's roars and the sound of battle. Today you face more than frightened men and crude weapons. Today you face the will of those who remember what Middle-earth was meant to be. The dragon's fire struck Gandalf's barrier and broke apart like waves against stone, dispersing harmlessly into the air above the battlefield. But Smaug was cunning as well as strong. Instead of continuing the futile assault against the wizard's defenses, he launched himself into the air with a great beating of wings. If he could not burn his enemies while they stood together, he would separate them, strike at them individually, force the alliance to break apart under the weight of their fear. It was a sound, tactical decision. It was also exactly what Gwaihir had been waiting for. The Lord of the Eagles struck Smaug from above as the dragon rose into the air, his talons raking across the beast's spine with enough force to send scales spinning away like dark coins. Behind him came his kindred, eagles whose ancestors had fought alongside Erendil himself, whose courage had been tested in battles against the winged horrors of Thangorodrim. They attacked in waves, never giving Smaug time to focus on any single target, never allowing him to bring his full strength to bear against them. One would strike and wheel away before the dragon could retaliate, only to be replaced by another from a different angle, then another, then half a dozen more. Gwaihir had fought dragons before, in the wars of the Elder Days, when such creatures had darkened the skies above Beleriand like a plague of shadows. He knew their strengths, their vast power, their terrible fire, their armored hides that could turn aside the finest weapons, but he also knew their weaknesses, the gaps in their knowledge that came from too much pride and too little respect for the cunning of their enemies. Dragons expected to fight on the ground, where their size was an overwhelming advantage. They did not expect to be harried from above by creatures whose speed matched their own, whose maneuverability exceeded theirs, whose coordination could turn a single great enemy into a confused target beset from all sides. "Keep him airborne," Gwaihir called to his followers, his voice carrying clearly in the ancient tongue of his people. "Do not let him land. Do not let him choose his ground." The eagles obeyed with the discipline of warriors who had learned their craft in the service of Manwë himself. They struck and wheeled and struck again, their talons finding gaps in Smaug's armor, their wings beating with enough force to disturb the dragon's own flight, their cries echoing across the battlefield like the voices of Valar made manifest. From his position at the edge of the field, Elrond Half-Elven raised his hand and spoke a single word in the ancient tongue. Vilya, the ring of air, blazed upon his finger with light that seemed to hold all the colors of the rainbow within its crystal depths. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The arrows of the woodland realm began to fly straighter and strike harder, their enchantments enhanced by the power of the mightiest of the three rings. The eagles moved faster and struck with greater force, their natural abilities amplified beyond what even their ancient lineage should have allowed. Gandalf's barrier of light grew brighter and stronger, turning aside dragon fire that should have overwhelmed any purely mortal defense. Most importantly, the coordination between the different forces of the Alliance became perfect, each group moving in harmony with the others, each attack timed to support and enhance the efforts of their comrades. Under Vilya's influence, they fought not as separate armies, but as a single entity with a common purpose. Smaug felt the change immediately. Where before he had faced skilled opponents working together, now he confronted something altogether more dangerous, a force that moved with unity of purpose he had not encountered since the last alliance itself. "No," he snarled, finally understanding the true scope of what he faced. "This cannot be. The rings of power are hidden. The strength of the Elder Days has faded. You cannot—" His words were cut short as a concentrated volley of arrows struck him from 3 different directions simultaneously. Thranduil's shot found the gap beneath his right wing. A flight of eagles dove from above to rake his neck with their talons. The surviving archers of Gondor, led by Steward Pelindur himself, loosed their remaining arrows from the ancient bows recovered from the royal armory. For the first time in his long and violent life, Smaug felt genuinely afraid. Not merely surprised or frustrated or angry, but actually frightened by the possibility that he might not survive the day. These enemies had found a way to coordinate their attacks that negated his advantages while exploiting his weaknesses. They struck at him from angles he could not defend against all at once. With weapons enhanced by power he could not match. Worst of all, they were hurting him. Really hurting him. The accumulated damage from hundreds of enchanted arrows and dozens of eagle strikes was beginning to tell. His movements were slower, his fire less hot, his great strength ebbing like tide from a broken shore. The killing blow came from an unexpected source. Captain Mablung had survived the destruction of Caer Andros, had lived through the siege of Minas Tirith, had watched his king die in hopeless defiance against impossible odds. He had seen the greatest kingdom of men reduced to smoking ruins, had witnessed the death of everything he had sworn to protect. But he had also seen the dragon bleed, the man who had once commanded the garrison of Gondor's greatest fortress, now carried the simplest of weapons. A hunting bow that had belonged to some citizen of the lower city, strung with cord that had been salvaged from the ruins. His arrows were not enchanted by elven craft or enhanced by ancient power. They were simple shafts of ash wood tipped with steel, the kind that any forester might use to bring down a deer. But Mablung had spent 15 years studying the art of war, and he understood something that more powerful warriors sometimes forgot, that battles were not always won by the mightiest weapons, but by the shafts that found their mark at the crucial moment. As Smaug writhed in the air above the field, beset from all sides by enemies that struck faster than he could counter, a gap opened in his defenses. Just for a moment, as the dragon turned to snap at an eagle that had raked his flank, the great scales that protected his chest shifted apart to reveal the softer hide beneath. Mablung drew his simple bow to its full extent and loosed his arrow with all the skill that 20 years of service had taught him. The shaft flew true as any that had ever been shot, guided not by magic, but by the desperate love of a man for his destroyed homeland. The arrow punched through Smaug's hide, just below the breastbone, sliding between ribs to pierce the great heart that had pumped dragon fire through his veins for thousands of years. It was not a large wound, barely visible against the dragon's vast bulk, but it was perfectly placed. Smaug's roar of shock and anguish shook the very foundations of the earth. The dragon's wings folded as his strength failed him entirely, and he fell from the sky like a star cast down from heaven. The impact when Smaug struck the earth was like the falling of a mountain. His massive body gouged furrows in the Pelennor fields that would remain visible for generations, while the shockwave of his landing knocked warriors from their feet for a mile in every direction. But the dragon was not quite dead. Even with his heart pierced, even with his strength failing, Smaug retained enough power for one final act of malice. He raised his great head toward the alliance that had brought him low, and his eyes blazed with the fury of defeat. "You think you have won?" he gasped, his voice now weak but still audible across the field. "You think the death of Smaug the Mighty ends the threat to your precious realm?" His gaze fixed on Gandalf, and for a moment something like understanding passed between them. Dragon to wizard, creature of shadow to servant of light. "I was sent here," Smaug continued, his words growing fainter with each syllable, sent by a power that dwarfs even mine. The necromancer of Dol Guldur promised me treasures beyond counting, and I believed his lies, because my greed made me blind to his true purpose. The dragon's laugh was like the grinding of broken stones. He never intended for me to survive this battle. He meant for me to weaken you, to destroy your greatest kingdom, to leave Middle-earth vulnerable for the war he plans to wage. I was his pawn, no more than a weapon to be used and discarded. Smaug's eyes began to dim, but his voice carried one final curse. I name you both betrayers, the Shadow Lord who used me, and the kingdom that destroyed me. May you find in each other the enemies you deserve. With those words, the last great dragon of the north died. His passing was marked by a flash of light that could be seen from Rivendell to the Grey Havens, the release of all the fire that had burned within him, all the malice and greed and ancient power that had made him the terror of the age. When the light faded, nothing remained but a great mound of scales and bone lying still beneath the grey sky. Smaug the terrible, Smaug the mighty, Smaug the unassailable, was no more. In the silence that followed the dragon's death, the survivors of the Alliance stood among the ruins of their victory and contemplated what they had won and what it had cost them. Minas Tirith lay broken behind them, its white towers collapsed, its proud halls reduced to smoking ruins. The greatest city of men would need decades to rebuild, if indeed it could ever reclaim its former glory. King Onderher was dead, his royal line ended, his kingdom leaderless in the aftermath of catastrophe. But Middle-earth was free of dragons. The last great threat of the Elder Days had been vanquished, and the free peoples had proven that when they stood together, no darkness could prevail against them. Steward Pelennor approached the fallen dragon with wonder and sorrow warring in his eyes. The man who had served kings now found himself the regent of ruins, responsible for rebuilding a kingdom from ashes and memory. What did he mean? Pelennor asked quietly, addressing the question to Gandalf. About the necromancer's true purpose? About leaving us vulnerable for a greater war? The wizard's face was grave as he studied the dragon's still form. He meant that our troubles are far from over, Gandalf replied. Smaug may be dead, but the power that sent him against us still stirs in Dol Guldur. The shadow grows stronger with each passing year, and now it knows that we can be hurt, that our greatest defenses can be broken. But we won, protested Thranduil, his own expression troubled despite their victory. The dragon is slain, the immediate threat ended. Yes, Gandalf agreed. We won, but victory has its own price, and we have paid it in full. The question now is whether we can learn from Smaug's revelations, whether we can prepare for the greater darkness that his death may have hastened. The wizard looked up at the smoke that still rose from Minas Tirith, at the broken towers and fallen walls of the kingdom that had stood as a beacon of hope for 3,000 years. The age of kings may be ending, he said quietly, but the age of the free peoples has only just begun. The price of victory. 3 days after the dragon's death, Steward Pelennor stood atop the ruins of what had once been the Tower of Ecthelion, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of the task that lay before him. Below him, Minas Tirith stretched like a broken crown across the mountainside. The first 4 levels were gone entirely. Nothing remained but blackened stone and twisted metal, great piles of rubble that would take months simply to clear. The 5th and 6th levels bore the scars of dragon fire. Their proud buildings collapsed or gutted, their courtyards choked with debris. Only the 7th level, protected by the ancient wards until the very end, retained anything approaching its former glory. It was not just the physical destruction that overwhelmed him. Minas Tirith had housed nearly 40,000 souls before Smaug's coming. Now perhaps 15,000 remained. Those who had survived the evacuation to the lower levels, those who had fled the city entirely during the siege, those few who had found shelter in the deepest chambers when the dragon's fury was unleashed. The rest were gone, claimed by fire or smoke, or the simple terror that had driven them to flee into the wilderness where wolves and worse things hunted. Half his people, gone in the space of a week. Pelendur was 63 years old, and he had served the crown of Gondor for 40 years. He had helped to govern a kingdom at the height of its power, had counseled kings whose word was law from the misty mountains to the sea. Now he found himself the regent of ruins, responsible for rebuilding a realm from ash and memory, with resources that seemed impossibly inadequate to the task. Yet as he stood among the wreckage, watching his people begin the slow work of clearing rubble and sorting through the remains of their lives, Pelendur felt something unexpected stirring in his chest. Not despair, but determination. Not grief for what was lost, but resolve for what could yet be saved. "The reports from the lower levels?" he asked Captain Mablung, who had become his closest adviser in the absence of the royal family. "Better than we feared," Mablung replied, consulting the tablets that had become his constant companions. "The food stores in the deep cellars remain mostly intact, enough to feed the survivors for perhaps 2 months if we are careful. The armory was damaged, but not destroyed entirely. And the treasury?" He paused, then smiled for the first time in weeks. "The treasury is undamaged, my lord. The dragon never found the royal vaults." Pelendur nodded slowly. Gold alone would not rebuild their city, but it would buy materials and hire craftsmen and feed workers while they labored. More importantly, it would serve as proof that Gondor endured, that the realm had not been reduced to complete poverty by the dragon's assault. "And the other matter?" "The dragon's hoard?" Mablung's smile widened. "Scattered across the Pelennor like a field of stars, my lord. Teams are still collecting it, but the initial estimates suggest wealth beyond our ability to count. Gold and silver from Erebor, certainly, but also artifacts and treasures that the beast gathered during his rampage. The Palantir of Osgiliath was recovered intact, along with crowns and weapons and jewelry that represent the accumulated wealth of kingdoms. For a moment, Pelendur allowed himself to feel something approaching relief. Dragons were greedy creatures by nature, and Smaug's death had scattered his vast hoard across the battlefield like some cosmic jest. The treasure that the beast had accumulated to feed his avarice would now fund the reconstruction of everything he had destroyed. There was a justice in that which appealed to the old steward's sense of irony. "What word from our allies?" he asked, turning his attention to the more delicate matter of politics. "They remain, my lord. Lord Elrond has established a camp near the Ramas Ekor, and his people work alongside our own in clearing the roads. King Thranduil has sent his warriors to patrol the borders, ensuring that our weakness does not invite new enemies. And Gandalf," Mablung hesitated. "Gandalf speaks of staying through the winter if his counsel would be welcome." "More than welcome," Pelendur said firmly. "We will need all the wisdom we can gather in the months ahead." That evening, the leaders of the Alliance gathered in what had once been the great hall of the Citadel, now open to the sky, but still recognizable as a place where important matters were discussed. They sat around a table that had been salvaged from the ruins, its carved surface scorched but intact, sharing wine that had somehow survived the dragon's assault. "The question we must address," Elrond said, his ageless face grave in the flickering light of torches. is what comes next. Not merely for Gondor, but for all of Middle-earth. Smaug's final words trouble me greatly. As they should, Gandalf replied, refilling his cup from a bottle that bore the royal seal of Gondor. The dragon spoke truly when he claimed to have been manipulated by the necromancer. This attack was planned, coordinated, designed to achieve specific goals. But the dragon is dead, Thranduil pointed out. Surely his master's plan has failed. The wizard's expression was grim as he shook his head. Has it? Consider what has been accomplished. The greatest kingdom of men has been crippled, its capital city reduced to ruins, its royal line ended. The population has been scattered, the military weakened, the treasury depleted. Even with the dragon's horde to aid reconstruction, it will be years before Gondor can field armies comparable to those it commanded a week ago. He leaned forward, his grey eyes reflecting the torchlight like stars. Now imagine that the necromancer has spent those same years building his own power, gathering orc armies in the darkness, forging weapons in the fires of Mount Doom. When he finally reveals himself, what will stand against him? Gondor, weak and rebuilding, the scattered realms of the north, the elven kingdoms, already diminished and preparing for their own departure to the west. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. They had won a great victory, had slain the last dragon, and saved Middle-earth from a terror that had haunted it since the Elder Days. But that victory had come at a price that might prove too high to pay. Yet we did stand together, Elrond observed quietly. Men and elves and eagles, fighting as one force with a single purpose. That unity is itself a weapon against the darkness, one that did not exist before this crisis brought us together. Indeed, Thranduil agreed, raising his cup in a gesture that seemed to include all of them. Before this week, my people had little cause to think kindly of Gondor. We traded with them, yes, but we didn't trust them, did not see their fate as linked to our own. Now, he gestured toward the ruined city beyond the broken walls. Now we have shed blood together, have shared victory and loss. That creates bonds that diplomacy alone cannot forge. Steward Pelendur, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What you have given us goes beyond mere alliance," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You came to our aid when we faced annihilation. You fought beside us when hope seemed lost. You shared the price of victory with us." He looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "Gondor will not forget this debt. Whatever darkness comes, you will not face it alone." "Nor will you," Elrond replied simply. "The shadow that threatens Gondor threatens all the free peoples. When that threat finally reveals itself, we will stand together, as we did on the Pelennor fields." The monument was completed a month after the dragon's death, erected in the center of what had once been the Court of the Fountain. It was not large or elaborate. There had been neither time nor resources for grand gestures, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Two figures carved from white stone, a king and a prince standing back to back with swords raised, their faces turned toward different horizons, as though guarding against threats that might come from any direction. The inscription at its base was brief but moving. "Here stood Ondoher the king, and Artemor the bold, who chose death before dishonor and glory before safety. Their sacrifice lights the darkness still." Pelendur stood before the monument as the sun set behind the western mountains, thinking of the two men who had given their lives to purchase this fragile victory. He had served them both, had watched the prince grow from a boy into a man, had counseled the king through the darkest hours of his reign. Their deaths had been necessary, perhaps even noble, but that did not make them any less painful to contemplate. "They would be proud," said a voice behind him, and he turned to find Gandalf approaching with his usual measured pace. Both of them. To see their city rising from the ashes, their people rebuilding with such determination. They would be proud of what you have accomplished in their name. "I have accomplished nothing yet," Pellindur replied, but there was less despair in his voice than there had been weeks ago. "The real work has only just begun. We must rebuild not just the city, but the kingdom. We must restore not just the walls, but the confidence of our people. We must prove that Gondor endures, despite everything we have lost." "And you will," the wizard said, with quiet certainty. "Not because the task is easy, but because you are the right man to undertake it. Onderher chose you as his steward for good reason, and that reason was not merely your competence with accounts and schedules." Gandalf placed a hand on the older man's shoulder, and for a moment Pellindur felt some of the burden he carried seem lighter. "The crown of Gondor has passed to you in all but name, my friend. You may not bear the title of king, but you bear the responsibility of one. Do not think the people fail to understand the difference." In the weeks that followed, that responsibility manifested itself in 1,000 different ways. Young nobles who had lost fathers and brothers in the dragon's assault stepped forward to take on roles they had never expected to inherit so early. Craftsmen whose workshops had been destroyed began the work of rebuilding with tools borrowed from other realms. Farmers whose fields had been trampled by fleeing refugees returned to plant new crops with seed grain provided by Rohan and the woodland realm. The work was hard, often heartbreaking, but it proceeded with a determination that surprised even those who undertook it. Perhaps it was the knowledge that they had faced the worst Middle-earth could offer and survived. Perhaps it was the memory of standing together against impossible odds and emerging victorious. Or perhaps it was simply the understanding that there was no alternative. They could rebuild, or they could perish. Lady Morwen, sister to the fallen Captain General who had died in Osgiliath's defense, took charge of organizing the city's new guard. Master Beregond, whose father had served as the Citadel's chief engineer, began the delicate work of restoring the ancient wards that had protected the upper levels. Young Lord Denethor, whose family had served as stewards to the stewards for generations, proved unexpectedly gifted at the complex negotiations required to secure materials and aid from Gondor's neighbors. They were not the same people who had lived in the White City before the dragon's coming. They could not be. Too much had been lost. Too many illusions had been shattered, but they were perhaps stronger for having been broken and reformed, tempered by fire like steel in a forge. The first snows of winter brought word from the east that made Gandalf's warnings seem prophetic rather than cautious. Refugees fleeing the borders of Mordor spoke of increased activity in the Black Land, smoke rising from the mountain, orc bands moving in greater numbers, a sense of purpose and preparation that had not been evident in previous years. "He knows," Gandalf said simply when the reports reached him. "Sauron knows that his gambit has failed, that Smaug is dead, and the alliance holds firm. He will not wait much longer to reveal himself." Pellindur received this news in his temporary study, a chamber in the deepest level of the citadel that had been hastily converted to serve as the center of government while the upper levels were rebuilt. Maps covered every available surface, marked with progress reports from the reconstruction efforts and intelligence summaries from the kingdom's scouts. "How long do we have?" the steward asked, though he suspected he would not like the answer. "Difficult to say," the wizard replied. "Years, certainly. Perhaps a decade or more. He will not move until his preparations are complete, and those preparations are vast beyond imagining. Gandalf studied the map that showed Gondor's current military position, scattered garrisons, reduced numbers, defensive works that existed more on paper than in reality. The question is whether we will be ready when he does. "We will have to be," Pellindur said simply. "There is no other choice." Outside the windows of the study, snow began to fall on the ruins of Minas Tirith, covering the scars of dragon fire with a blanket of pristine white. The city slept under winter's protection, but even in sleep it was changing, growing, healing from wounds that had seemed mortal only months before. In the harbour of Pelargir, ships arrived daily carrying materials and volunteers from across Middle-earth. In the workshops of the lower levels, smiths worked by lamplight to forge tools and weapons for the tasks ahead. In the halls where children learned their letters, teachers spoke of the heroes who had died to protect their future, ensuring that the sacrifice of kings would not be forgotten. The dragon was dead. The immediate threat had passed, but Gandalf's warnings echoed in every plan that was made, every alliance that was forged, every preparation that was undertaken. The darkness was coming, greater and more terrible than anything that had come before. When it arrived, it would find not the broken remnant of a once great kingdom, but a people who had learned the price of victory and were prepared to pay it again. The Age of Kings was ending, just as Gandalf had said, but the age of the free peoples, the age of alliance and unity, of sacrifice and determination, had only just begun. In the east, shadows gathered like storm clouds on the horizon, but in Minas Tirith, the white city of Gondor, light still burned in windows that looked toward the dawn.